Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the What If guy, back with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Issei Met Chulainn's Heir. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Issei walked to school with a pounding headache. He had dreamed of a giant red dragon surrounded by flames, and the strange part had been that the creature had seemed to try to communicate with him. He planned to ask Rias what it might mean. As he crossed the gate into the school grounds, he noticed a black-haired young man sitting beneath a tree eating and staring in his direction. Issei turned and realized no one stood behind him, so the stranger must have been looking at him. He wondered if the new student had recently transferred in. Motohama and Matsuda called out to Issei from behind him, and Issei turned away from the stranger. Motohama told him that he had the latest season of a popular magical girl series and invited Issei to come over after school to watch it. Matsuda added that it was an exciting release and that Issei should come by. Matsuda answered Issei's surprised question cryptically when asked how he had obtained it, and Issei sighed in annoyance as he remembered the new student beneath the tree. Issei then asked his friends whether they knew if a new transfer student had arrived. Motohama nodded and admitted he had heard rumors. He hoped the new arrival might be in their class and possibly a girl. Matsuda expressed a crude enthusiasm, which made Issei groan inwardly. Issei told them he thought the new student was a boy, explaining that he had seen someone sitting under a tree earlier. The two friends looked where he pointed and found the spot empty. Their conversation was interrupted by the bell signaling class. When the three reached their classroom, they learned that the new student was not in their class but was indeed male. At lunch, Issei went to the cafeteria to sit with his clubmates. He sat beside Kiba and found Kaneko and Asia already there. Issei asked whether the president and Akino were present yet. Kiba sighed and said they had not arrived, and he suggested that the new transfer student's presence might be responsible for the delay because many of the female students had taken notice of him and called him the second prince of the academy. Issei's jaw dropped at the idea of a new pretty boy on campus. Before he could ask more, raised voices drew everyone's attention. Matsuda and the Kendo Club president, Murayama, were arguing after a tense encounter. The confrontation had escalated into a brief scuffle and heated words before the bell rang again and sent everyone back to class. Rumors about the new student spread throughout the day. Most of the stories concerned how Matsuda had been rude when the transfer student, Edward, had tried to introduce himself. With the school day over and no meeting called by Rias, Issei went home intending to catch up on sleep. By the end of the week, the rumors had only intensified. One story claimed that Edward had a girlfriend back home in Ireland, a rumor that began when a second-year student asked him out and he politely declined, mentioning a girlfriend. The boys took some comfort in the idea, and the nickname, Second Prince of Kuoh Academy, stuck. During the final PRD on Friday, Kiba announced that Asia and Issei were to report to the Occult Research Club room after school. Issei felt the many stares of the other students and wished only to get out of the building and away from their attention. When Issei and Asia entered the club room, they found Rias and Akino present and the others acting calm. Kiba sat on the couch reading a book. Kaneko ate snacks. Akino stood near Rias. Asia looked around with concern. Issei felt out of the loop, especially since Rias's summons had sounded urgent and yet everyone else seemed composed. It was Friday and Issei had hoped to rest. Rias motioned for Issei to take a seat, and he did. He asked why she had called them in and mentioned that the message had sounded urgent. Kiba chuckled and said that the others were just as clueless as Issei. Rias then rose from her desk and explained that she had called the meeting to talk about the new transfer student who had arrived earlier in the week. This announcement captured everyone's full attention. Issei noticed three things about the new boy. He was always eating takoyaki or yakitori and the teachers did not seem to care. He rarely showed his emotions, and the Red Dragon Emperor thought he was a remarkably pretty boy. Akino teased Rias with a peculiar smile, suggesting that Rias wanted the strange boy from the Emerald Isle all to herself. Rias blushed a deep red and shook her head vigorously, explaining that she was interested in the boy's power for the peerage and that he had claimed to already be seeing someone. Issei glanced at Kiba and wondered what the knight thought, since the new student was in Kiba's class. Kiba admitted that the boy seemed ordinary from a distance, but when he got too close he felt a strong foreboding, as if his devil instincts were telling him to run away. The others reacted with a mixture of alarm and surprise at Kiba's warning. A strange voice then pointed out that Kiba's instincts were simply recognizing someone far stronger, and everyone jumped when they realized the person they had been discussing was standing right behind Rias. Everyone readied themselves for a fight. Kiba summoned his holy eraser, Kaneko assumed a martial arts stance, Akino formed a glowing purple magic circle in her hand, and Issei activated the boosted gear. Rias turned and saw the man they had been talking about, Edward Strauss, with blackish-blue hair and dull crimson eyes. Despite claiming to be Irish, he showed no accent and no obvious signs of his origins. He carried an air of mystery rather than normality. Rias demanded to know how he had entered the old school building, pointing out the powerful wards that should keep out anyone who was not in her peerage or a fellow devil. Edward scoffed at the wards and dismissed them as inadequate, remarking that the Gremory heir had a long way to go if those were her strongest protections. The comment made everyone tense and curious about how he knew they were devils. Edward explained that Citri had told him after he revealed he was aware of her identity. Kaneko prepared to strike on command and demanded clarification of his words. Edward assured them he did not intend to be a threat to Rias or Citri, provided he was not provoked. His monotone delivery made the assurance sound like a warning rather than a comfort, and the tension in the room grew. Rias questioned whether his statement had been a warning or a threat. Edward called it a warning and, to underscore his words, a small tear appeared beside him. The presence of the tear released an intense holy aura, reminiscent of a powerful holy sword, and Asia, Issei, Kaneko, and Kiba dropped to their knees while Rias and Akino trembled with the force of it. The tear closed and Edward moved toward the door of the old school building. Rias called him to a halt and asked, in quick succession, who he was, whether the aura had been a holy sword, whether he was with the church or an exorcist, and why he was there. Edward answered in reverse order. He had come because of a falling out back home, he was not an exorcist and was not affiliated with the church, the presence had indeed been that of a holy sword, and, finally, he said he was Irish. With that, he left, leaving the devils in a state of mild annoyance and confusion. Issei voiced concern about the inconsistency of a holy sword wielder not belonging to the church. Kiba agreed that such a thing should be impossible in theory, yet he could sense that Edward had been honest. He did not appear to be a member of the church, and the aura they had felt did seem to come from a holy blade. Worried about what they did not understand, Rias instructed the peerage to keep a close eye on Edward and report any suspicious behavior. The group agreed and prepared to watch him carefully. 1 week later, Issei yawned loudly as he and Asia walked to school. He admitted he had not been able to sleep the night before. Asia asked if he had had a nightmare. The only pawn of his master glanced at the bishop with a wry smile. Issei confessed that he had a weird feeling that something bad might happen that day. Someone else asked if he meant that someone close to him might be hurt. He and Asia turned and found Edward staring at them with an expressionless face. Issei positioned himself between Asia and the Irishman and demanded to know what Edward wanted. Edward sighed in annoyance and explained that he had nothing in particular to ask. He only wondered if he could walk to school with them, since he did not have any friends in Japan yet except Miss Citri, if one could call their chess games friendship. Asia and Issei both winced slightly. Asia, who knew what it felt like to be without friends, felt sympathy for someone far from home. Asia said she did not mind if Edward joined them, and Issei agreed to let Edward walk to school with them. Edward bowed lightly and thanked them. The three continued toward the school together. As they entered the gates, a few girls muttered hostile things toward Issei, warning him about Edward. Edward had not expected this and, to make it stop, glared and released a small burst of aura. The effect was immediate. The girls quieted. Issei and Asia watched with surprise. Issei asked why Edward had defended him given his reputation, and whether he could call him Edward. Edward acknowledged that he knew of Issei's reputation but had not expected such harsh treatment for merely walking with him. He said he did not mind being called Edward as long as he could call them by their first names. Asia smiled and welcomed the idea of friendship, and Edward allowed himself a small, almost unnoticed smile in return. The bell rang for the start of classes, and the three headed inside. Before joining his classmates, Edward opened a small tear in the air, reached in, and began rummaging. After pulling his hands out with a sheepish expression, he admitted that he had forgotten his box of yakitori. He muttered that the day was off to a rough start. At the end of the school day, Issei and Asia entered the club room and immediately felt the tension among the members. Issei asked the club president why everyone was so tense. Rias explained that they were expecting a visitor from the underworld soon and that she expected Issei to behave and let her handle the situation. Issei remembered a strange event from the previous night. Rias had appeared in his room and made an unexpected NTMT request that left him flustered and confused until a silver-haired maid had arrived and taken Rias away. He resolved to be ready for anything, but his thoughts were interrupted when a burst of energy appeared on the floor. A burnt orange magic circle flared, and a tall, well-groomed blonde man stepped out. Issei felt an instant dislike toward the newcomer. The man scanned the room and settled his gaze on Rias with a possessive expression. He addressed Rias in a flattering tone and declared himself Rias's fiancé. He then claimed that once they were wed, Rias's servants would belong to him. Issei reacted with outrage at the implication. Before the situation could escalate further, the grimoire seal flared and the silver-haired maid from the previous night stepped forward. She introduced herself as Graphia Lucifuge, the head maid of the grimoire family and the queen associated with Surzex Lucifer, and identified the blonde as Riser Phoenix, third son of the Phoenix clan and Rias's purported fiancé. Rias made it clear that she would only marry someone of her own choosing and rejected the arrangement. Graphia moved to manage the introduction and the tension in the room. A brief pause followed as the members absorbed the announcement. Graphia explained that Rias's parents had anticipated such developments and had suggested that, if Rias wanted this matter resolved, she could take part in a rating game to settle it. Riser laid out the terms of the rating game. If Rias won, the marriage contract would be broken. If she lost, the consequences would fall to her. Rias cut Graphia off and accepted the challenge without hesitation, and Riser laughed openly at the audacity. Riser boasted that he had won every rating game he had entered and that his peerage was complete. With a snap of his fingers, a flash of orange light revealed 15 girls standing behind him. Their appearances varied. One of the girls with twin blonde drills looked familiar enough to draw a sharp reaction from Aquino, who reacted in disgust at the sight that Riser had placed his own sister, Ravel, in his peerage. Riser explained that Ravel was included at their parents' request. Riser noticed Issei staring and mocking curiosity. He taunted the young man, suggesting that Issei was enjoying something he would never attain. Issei blinked in shock at the insult. Riser then put on a showy display of affection with his queen, Ubeluna, which the grimoire group found distasteful while Issei grew more agitated. Riser stopped the display and told Issei he would never have his own peerage because he was weak. To prove his point, he ordered Mira forward. Mira, a blue-haired girl in ritual garb with bandages on her forearms and guards on her hands, raised her staff and prepared to strike toward Issei's midsection. The door burst open at that moment and drew every eye. The newcomer was Edward, who moved into the room with an odd habit of sniffing the air as he took in the scene. Graphia glanced at Rias with an accusing look and reminded her that she had said only 2 new servants had been gained, but Rias clarified that Edward was not her servant, only a student who seemed aware of the supernatural world. Edward approached Riser and, almost instinctively, brought Riser's hand close to his face. Riser began to protest. Edward then reacted suddenly, biting down on the hand with an animalistic intensity that startled everyone. The peerage rushed to restrain the struggling pair, pulling Edward away while he held on stubbornly, eyes wide with a wild hunger. The sight was alarming enough that Rias did not want the transfer student harmed. Rias asked Kaneko for help. Kaneko handed her a piece of chocolate, and Rias stepped into the fray, waving the sweet in front of Edward. The gesture brought a flicker of reason back into his expression. He released Riser's hand and took the chocolate. He apologized and explained that he sometimes became like that when very hungry and that he normally carried snacks, but he had forgotten them that day and had smelled something grilled chicken that set him off. Another piece of chocolate was offered and accepted, and Edward's composure returned. Reiser did not let the insult go. Standing, he flared with anger and unleashed a ball of fire toward Edward. The flames swirled around the boy in a dramatic burst, and when the magic subsided, a glowing green circle hovered around Edward, bearing a peculiar symbol. Edward met Reiser's glare coolly and reminded him that he had already apologized, adding a dry, mischievous comment that he could not be blamed for smelling, and perhaps tasting, tempting. His tone was bold, not conciliatory. Reiser, seething, declared that he wanted Edward on Rias's side so he would have the chance to confront him later. He gave 10 days for training and warned that even then victory would be unlikely for their opponents. With that, Reiser and his peerage vanished in another flash of orange light. Grafia stepped forward to examine Edward and then informed him that he had, for the time being, joined Lady Rias in her raiding game against Lord Reiser. As a result, he would act as a temporary servant of Lady Rias until the raiding game concluded. Grafia departed in a flash of red light, leaving the students from Kuoh alone in the occult research club room. Edward blinked, a resigned sigh escaping him as he muttered that he had not expected to be drawn into something like this when he moved to Japan and that his father would likely laugh at the story. With that, the fate of Rias Gremory rested with her peerage and the mysterious transfer student from the Emerald Isle. The entire club room fell silent as everyone stared at the transfer student whose eyes were shadowed. The way he looked unnerved them and sent chills down their spines. Rias had just finished explaining the situation to Edward and what he had unexpectedly become involved in. Edward asked with disbelief whether he had essentially been dragged into this because Rias wanted to break an arranged marriage contract with Lord Reiser, addressing Rias as Miss Gremory. His crimson eyes lifted to meet the red-haired demon. Rias confirmed that this was essentially the case, then, as the peerage's king, asked which piece he wished to take for their side. Her question made the Irishman stare at her dead in the eye. Silence fell again as the Ravenet studied the club president. The dull look in his eyes and his expressionless face unnerved Rias and the rest of the peerage. Asia stood up and asked about training, pointing out that they had 10 days to prepare and asking where they would train. Rias had intended to answer, but Edward cut her off. He declared that they would all come to his house for training and that he did not want to hear complaints, since he had been dragged into the situation and could at least choose the training location. He placed a slip of paper on Rias's desk and left the club room, leaving everyone dumbfounded. After the door closed, the group reacted in different ways. Rias flushed with fury and slammed her hands on her desk. Aquino and Kiba looked slightly odd, Asia was speechless, Kaneko was indifferent, and Issei was as furious as Rias. Rias demanded who that human thought he was. Kaneko replied that he was the one dragged into their affairs because of Rias's marriage contract. Rias looked at her rook with annoyance, then sighed and went. Melancholy, admitting that she had never wanted to involve bystanders or ordinary people aware of the supernatural. The others could hear she was telling the truth. She truly had not wanted him involved, but he had become involved when he bit the Phoenix Scion's hand. Issei asked why he had bitten that high-class devil's hand, and Kiba suggested that Edward had said he was hungry, which everyone nodded at, though the question of why he had behaved that way remained. They turned their attention to the slip of paper on the desk. Aquino opened the paper, tilted her head, and said that something did not make sense. Rias took the paper and realized the coordinates pointed to the base of a nearby mountain, which made the entire peerage except Aquino stare at their king with wide eyes and open jaws. Issei protested loudly at the prospect of climbing a mountain the next day. Rias noted, nervously biting her thumbnail, that they had no choice since their temporary comrade did not want to leave his home. She ordered everyone to pack their bags and meet at the club room the next morning, then dismissed them. The next morning, Kaneko felt wary. The transfer student did not seem overtly dangerous, but he possessed a holy sword and was a potential threat whether ally or not. While they waited for the magic circle to finish calibrating to the coordinates, they made small talk about what Edward's house might be like and whether they would sleep under the stars or in a proper house. Aquino entered with a small smile and reported that the calibrations were complete and they were ready to leave for Edward Strauss's home. They stepped into the magic circle outside and it fired up, flashing red light that briefly blinded the Gremory group. When the light faded, they found themselves facing a cliffside. Rias expressed concern about how they would climb it. A mysterious child's voice called out, asking if they were the Gremmery group the child's master had mentioned, then giggled and directed them to look for a chibi octopus statue. The white-haired first-year pointed out a small glowing statue on top of a sign, and behind the sign they found a set of stairs leading up the cliff. The child announced that they must climb 300 steps to reach Edward's house and that Edward would see them at the top. Then the glow from the statue faded. The peerage looked up at the massive staircase and began the climb, grabbing their bags. Issei began to fall behind, slouching as the others passed him. Kiba strode past with a bag the same size as Issei's, then Kaneko passed carrying a bag 4 times his size. Frustrated, Issei jumped several steps at a time, overtook the others, and reached the top. He stopped in awe, jaw-dropping. Rias called to her beloved pawn, asking what was wrong. The rest of the peerage reached the top of the stairs and took in the sight of the house that awaited them. Only calling it a house did not fit what stood before them. It was a mansion in every sense. From the outside it was clear their fellow student came from wealth. Well-kept flower beds and trees framed a massive fountain with 4 hounds spouting water. The group was completely blown away. The place rose 4 stories high and promised many rooms. Edward asked if they were done gawking at his home and invited them inside so Shinra and Lulu could show them to their rooms. He then began to walk away with the devils following him, adding a new layer of mystery simply by the sight of his residence. Rias wondered how long he had lived up here alone, then corrected herself when she remembered he had spoken of 2 people and likely had servants living with him. At the doors Edward stopped and told the group that he currently had 4 guests, 3 with amnesia and 1 who had been in a coma for a while. He requested that they not make the guests nervous and noted that the guests were aware of the supernatural. He opened the doors, and 3 people were bowing toward him when they entered. The 3 servants greeted their master in unison and straightened to face the Gremmery group. 2 maids stood on either side of a taller butler, who stepped forward and introduced himself as Sebastian Michaelis, the head butler of the manor, and offered assistance if they needed anything. A small girl with lilac hair then announced that her name was Lulu and that she was 3rd in command of the staff. The group recognized that it was the same voice they had heard from the octopus statue. Before she finished, Lulu informed Edward that one of his guests had just woken up and was heading downstairs. Edward nodded and motioned for the last maid to speak. The taller girl with long blonde hair and green highlights introduced herself as Shinra, 2nd in charge when the master or Sebastian were not present, and warned them not to pester her with every little problem. Rias formed a quick impression of the staff. Sebastian appeared to be the linchpin that held everything together, Shinra seemed lazy and blunt, and Lulu came across as an eccentric child with little responsibility. Sebastian then called down to a guest on the stairs and asked about her sleep. The guest replied that it had been the best she had ever had. The familiar sound of the voice made the entire Gremmery group turn and gasp. A young woman stood on the staircase in a simple black nightgown trimmed with white lace, her blonde hair falling to mid-back and her blue eyes wide with confusion and worry. The group recognized her as Middlet, a fallen angel who had been presumed dead. Rias shouted that Middlet was a fallen angel and prepared a red magic circle, readying a destructive spell toward the startled blonde. Before she could release it, a sharp sound marked the sudden appearance of a spear, a great sword, and a dark magic circle drawn into place to protect the guest. Edward demanded to know what Rias had been about to do and warned that if she had intended to kill the guest, he would have had to draw his sword and respond. At that, Kaneko jumped forward and struck the butler hard in the gut, but Sebastian did not move. He fronted the white-haired girl, caught her by the collar, and lifted her so they met eye to eye. He gently admonished her that punching someone was not a good first impression, then propelled her back toward her friends, where Kiba and Issei caught her. Akino stared at the man and asked what the 3 servants were. The 3 servants regarded the devil with emotionless looks and revealed that all of the household staff, including themselves, were golems created by their master. The Gremmery group reacted with wide eyes and awe. Edward instructed Shinra and Lulu to take them to their rooms and to meet him out back for training once they had unpacked. The maids led them up the staircase, passing Middlet, who trembled under the stares of the peerage. After the devils disappeared into the corridors, Edward sighed with annoyance and asked Middlet if she had remembered anything. She shook her head and, trying to reassure him, claimed she remembered how to use her light powers. He accepted this, patted her head, and advised her not to push herself. He promised that her memories would return in time. With that, the master of the manor left to prepare for training, his expression growing more distant and unreadable. This had been the 6th week that she had lied to him, and he knew that if he asked the other 2 they would lie to him as well. He did not press them too hard. He played dumb and trusted that if they wanted to talk they would talk. Only the 4th one remained in a coma and showed no signs of waking. He remembered the time he had been sitting in the living room by the fire, learning Japanese while playing chess with Sebastian. Sebastian complimented that Edward was the best chess player he had ever met. Edward, the young Irish master, responded with a wry comment about Sebastian being the only other player he knew and joked that the butler had all the knowledge of chess. Sebastian admitted that he had been using that knowledge to try to win. A knock at the door interrupted them. Edward rose and walked toward it, Sebastian close behind. When the butler opened the door, 4 people stood there, bruised and battered, their clothing torn and their expressions exhausted. Their auras marked them as fallen angels, and Edward wondered what could have left them in such a state. One among them held an unconscious companion. They said they needed help and that they could not remember anything. Sebastian was about to question them further, but Edward stopped him and asked if they remembered their names so he would know what to call them. The blue-haired woman introduced herself as Chulainn. The older black-haired man gave his name as Donasek and indicated the unconscious friend he was holding. The young blonde identified herself as Middlet. The woman in the cloak was Heir, and Edward noticed that she appeared to be the worst. Injured, unable to use her right arm and left leg. Edward invited them inside and offered them shelter. He instructed that Tsubaki and Maka should get new clothes for the 3 able to move and that Shinra should take them to empty rooms on the 3rd floor. He asked Sebastian to fetch Lulu to help prepare food and to find Ox to take Heir to the med bay on the 4th floor for immediate treatment. Sebastian hesitated briefly at the conviction in his master's voice, then bowed and carried out the orders. The fallen angels had not expected the house to offer refuge. They had assumed the owner might turn them away. Surviving the earlier encounter with the Gremry faction had felt like a miracle, and now they hoped to heal and regroup. Yet the way the household's young master looked at them made them uneasy, as if something inside him was fragile. Edward introduced himself plainly as their host and expressed pleasure at meeting them. Middlet asked if he had a last name, explaining she needed to help him choose one before school began in a few weeks. Chulainn began to protest on her behalf, but Edward explained that he wanted a fake last name for the coming term. Donasek wondered why a last name mattered so much, but Edward, with a sudden gleam in his eyes, decided on Edward Strauss. Later, as he shook off the memory of their arrival, Edward found himself in front of his room. He sighed and went inside to prepare for training. Outside in the yard, Rias and her peerage waited. The backyard was simple, a small greenhouse and a few flower beds. Rias wondered whether the fallen angel had survived and if others might still be alive. She noticed Edward approaching and crossed her arms, glaring. She urged that training begin at once and told Edward she had questions for him afterward. Edward nodded and set a box down in front of them. He explained that the box contained weights for their wrists and ankles to help with speed and endurance, and he instructed everyone to take a pair. He wanted Issei to take 2 along with another member of the group. Edward held out a pair of metal shin and arm guards toward the knight and instructed that Kiba should wear them. He explained that Kiba's extra weights were to help him run faster while wearing the armor, while Issei's extra weights were to compensate for his lack of raw strength. Edward noted that Issei's endurance and speed were good and ordered everyone to put on their weights and begin running. Issei and Kiba exchanged puzzled looks but followed the order. The training began with a 20-lap run around the property, followed by several sprints up the stairs. By the time they finished, everyone was exhausted. Edward snapped his fingers and summoned Sebastian, Shinra, Lulu, and 2 new maids, one with long black hair in a ponytail and the other with light brown hair in twin tails. They arrived carrying boxed lunches. After lunch, the group moved on to more physical conditioning push-ups, sit-ups, and weightlifting. Edward explained that this work would help the body expand the amount of magical energy it could hold. With that in mind, the Gremry group pushed themselves harder to prepare for their confrontation with Riser. When the physical training ended, they shifted to individual skills. Rias practiced her power of destruction, Aquino focused on her lightning magic, Kaneko drilled martial arts, and Kiba honed his swordsmanship. Asia studied more magic under Shinra, and Issei sparred with Sebastian. Everyone made good progress except for 2 members, which Edward took note of. He called the group back to the manor to discuss the results and end the day. As they entered the manor, the maid Tsubaki asked for help with dinner. Aquino, Asia, and Issei volunteered, and Rias took the opportunity to confront their temporary ally about his house guests. Rias demanded to know why Edward had fallen angels living in his home, especially the 3 in question. Edward tilted his head in apparent confusion and asked if there was a problem with having them in his house. Rias growled and reminded him that those 3 had assisted a fallen angel named Heir in attacking Asia in an attempt to take her sacred gear, Twilight Healing. Rias demanded to know what Edward intended to do about them. Edward lowered his head, shadowing his eyes as he considered the matter, then called for Oxford. The butler appeared from a broom closet and responded to his master's command. Edward ordered Oxford to summon Middlet, Calawarner, and Donasek to the med bay on the 4th floor, then told Rias, Kiba, and Kaneko not to follow. He explained that the 4th floor housed his important possessions and the med bay and that he would address the issue at dinner. He instructed them to check on their servants and dinner preparations before he went upstairs, leaving the 3 Gremry devils stunned by the intensity in his crimson eyes. Middlet was panicking. Oxford had arrived with a summons from his master and she had found Calawarner and Donasek already gathered in the med bay. The 3 feared they were about to be expelled from the manor. Middlet, who only wanted a peaceful life in the house, worried urgently about their future. Donasek attempted to calm her by suggesting Edward might simply want to question them about the Gremry devils. Middlet only grew more frantic, regretting that they had not told the whole truth from the beginning. Their conversation was cut short when Edward revealed himself and confirmed he had guessed correctly that they still retained their memories and that Rias's accusations had merit. Middlet begged Edward to hear their side of the story. She explained why they had acted as they did, with Donasek and Calawarner filling in details and correcting misunderstandings as they went. When they finished, Edward's expression darkened. Edward summarized their account and asked for clarification. Azizel, leader of the Grigori, had supposedly ordered Kokabeel to instruct Heir to steal the sacred gear or eliminate the user if they posed a threat. The 3 fallen angels nodded in shame. Edward pointed out a problem with that story. He asked why Azizel, a scholar of sacred gears who presumably knew everything about them, would give such an order. Their faces went pale as the question sank in. Edward concluded that if Azizel had not given the order, then Kokabeel likely had, and he reminded them that Kokabeel was known for warmongering and a desire to provoke conflict. Edward surmised that their unknown patron had used the lower-level fallen angels to gather the materials he needed for the coming war, sacred gears. Donasek replied in a cold, gruff voice while looking at the ground that they could not simply return to the Grigori, and that they had caused significant harm to the nun and her companions, so forgiveness would not come easily. Edward acknowledged that their opponents might not forgive them, but insisted that Asia likely would. He admitted that he had only known her for a short time, but he believed Asia to be extremely forgiving and that if they told her everything she would probably understand. With that, Edward opened the door and motioned for the 3 fallen to follow. Without complaint, they trailed after their host, hoping to make amends. Dinner was ready and the food smelled delicious, but the atmosphere at the table was tense. On one side sat the Gremry group and on the other sat Edward and the fallen angels. Though plates were full and steaming, only Edward ate. Rias would not let the matter rest and pressed Edward to explain why he had not handled it as promised. The 3 fallen flinched at her anger until Edward raised his hand and declared that he had listened to both sides and concluded that the 3 fallen angels were innocent. Both the king and the pawn reacted with disbelief, accusing the fallen of aiding the enemy in harming Asia. Edward then asked Calawarner to explain her side of the story. Calawarner, the blue-haired fallen, told her account while Rias and Aquino appeared skeptical. Kiba, Kaneko, Issei, and Asia listened with reluctance. When Chulainn finished, Asia nodded slowly and said she would forgive them, but only if they showed sincere remorse to the others and earned back their trust. Chulainn exhaled in relief, and everyone began to eat. After the meal, Edward raised his hand to get everyone's attention and observed that the day's training had gone well. He warned that if they continued to hold back their power, particularly their queen and rook, they would likely lose to Lord Riser. His gaze hardened on Aquino Himejima and Kaneko Tuju, who both glared in response. Edward said he would see them in the morning for more training and asked Aquino and Kaneko to consider his words and try to use the power they were restraining. He then asked Shinra to show everyone to the baths. Edward left the table followed by the fallen angels and Sebastian. The others went to the baths to get clean. Issei attempted a mischievous effort to reach the women's side but failed because the barrier was reinforced by magic. Sebastian watched with an amused expression. After his bath, Issei announced that he would be doing special training alone, and Asia volunteered to help him. The rest turned in early to prepare for the day ahead. The day that would decide their fates had arrived, the rating game between Rias Gremory and Riser Phoenix. Rias had assigned roles and everyone knew their tasks. The previous day, Issei had demonstrated the progress of his power, Dragon Shot, in a display that altered a nearby mountaintop and showed how far he had come during the 10-day training camp. After the demonstration, they reviewed Riser's pieces, strengths and weaknesses, and likely placements. Tension in the ORC was justified as the 6 devils and 1 human prepared for combat. During their strategy meeting, Edward revealed that he possessed the sacred gear Jade Archery, a jade green bow that allowed him to shape arrows from elemental forces and imbue them with various properties. Pleased, Rias assigned him to guard their base from Riser's pawns. Kaneko, Kiba, and Aquino were tasked with placing traps throughout the forest to keep enemy servants from approaching the base. As preparations continued, Issei approached Edward and asked if he was nervous about the danger of the match, given his human status. Edward shook his head and explained that he was subbing in as a knight for Miss Gremory, which would allow him increased mobility during the game. He added that, if the situation became dire, he could rely on his trump card, his holy sword. The team took comfort in knowing he had such a safeguard, though Rias suspected he might also mean something else. Just then, the Gremory seal appeared beneath them all, flashing a bright red light. When the light faded, Issei noticed they were still in the clubroom. Rias pointed to the window and revealed that the sky outside had turned into a dazzling array of colors. Graphia Lucifuge introduced herself as a servant of the House of Gremory and the supervisor for the day's rating game between Lady Rias, heir to the House of Gremory, and Lord Riser, scion of the House of Phoenix. She explained that Lady Rias' base would be the old school building and Lord Riser's would be the student council room, and that both teams had 15 minutes to prepare. With that, Kaneko, Kiba, and Aquino went out to set traps in the woods around the aged building. Rias reviewed the plan once more with Issei, Asia, and Edward. Edward took his post on the roof to prepare his sacred gear. When the others returned having completed their tasks, the game began. Issei and Kaneko entered the gymnasium to secure it and found Riser's rook, Chulainn, and 3 pawns, Mira, Nell, and Isle, already there. The 2 sides stared at each other before Kaneko rushed forward to engage Chulainn while Issei handled the 3 pawns. The enemy fight was going well until Issei used a new skill he had been working on to immobilize the 3 girls. Kaneko scolded him for choosing a questionable tactic, and Issei insisted that it had worked and urged everyone to get out quickly. They left the building just before a giant blast of lightning hit and destroyed it. A status report shortly afterward indicated that Lord Riser had lost a rook and 3 pawns. Issei smiled briefly but was pushed by Kaneko and felt the force of another blast behind him. Turning around, he saw the school mascot appear briefly, scorched and shaken, before disappearing. An update to the status confirmed that one of Rias' rooks had been retired. Issei then saw Yubaluna, Lord Riser's queen, charging forward in anger over the defeat of her comrade. As she prepared to challenge the team directly, Aquino intervened, appearing in Shrine Maiden attire and unleashing a bolt of lightning that forced Yubaluna to pause. Aquino urged Issei to hurry to the field and reported that Kiba was already heading there and could use his help. She said she would handle the queen. Reluctantly, Issei ran toward the field. A new report indicated that 3 of Lord Riser's pawns had been retired, prompting Issei to suspect that Edward had been responsible. He filed the thought away and met Kiba at the fields. Rias sent a message that she and Asia were going out to confront Riser directly. Both men voiced concern and tried to dissuade her but could not change her mind. They wished their master well as she went to face Riser. On the other side of the field, Lord Riser's peerage took their positions. Bishops Ravel and Maihi, Knights Cirrus and Carloman, Rook Isabella, and Pawns Ni and Li. Carloman charged at Kiba, engaging him in a fierce sword duel, while Isabella attacked Issei. During his fight with Carloman, Kiba's holy eraser was destroyed by Carloman's fire sword. Carloman taunted him, and Kiba countered by producing another weapon that transformed before her eyes. Carloman was astonished to realize Kiba could summon multiple weapons. Kiba explained that his ability, Sword Birth, allowed him to create magical swords as needed. He demonstrated briefly by forming a circle of blades around him, though Carloman managed to escape its range before she could be retired from the match. Issei's duel with Isabella was more difficult. He tried to dodge her rapid punches until a single blow struck his midsection and sent him stumbling back several meters. He wiped his mouth and steadied himself while focusing on his gauntlet, preparing to charge a technique. He activated his boost and gathered a small orb of energy in his left palm. Isabella attempted to close the distance and interrupt him, but the orb fired off, narrowly missing her and striking the surrounding terrain, flattening a section of forest. Isabella recovered quickly and charged once more, forcing Issei to stumble backward before he regained his footing and struck her in the pit. He used the immobilizing skill again to restrain her briefly, then unleashed his dragon shot. The beam of energy struck Isabella and retired her from the match. A status update confirmed the retirement of one of Lord Riser's rooks. No sooner had he achieved that victory than Issei was swarmed by the Nicomeda twins and Cirrus. He struggled to fend them off and realized he was outmatched and weakening. More than his own predicament, he feared that if he were taken out now, Rias might lose without anyone to support her. A tense determination settled over him as he fought on. Issei swung the sacred gear on his left arm, struck the knight's sword, shattered it, and pushed her away. He invoked the Welsh dragon, asking for the power to protect his friends. A small surge answered him, but he shook his head in frustration and begged the dragon to sync with his feelings and grant him the strength he needed. The Welsh dragon responded with a second liberation, and a huge pillar of green energy burst outward. Inside that pillar, Issei's boosted gear deepened to a darker red and sprouted small golden spikes around the main jewel as a new gem appeared near the top. An idea struck Issei, and he told Kiba to put all of his power into his sacred gear and to trust him. Kiba, the blonde pretty boy, eyed the plan with slight skepticism before smiling and raising his sword to perform sword birth. The wave of energy he sent into the ground surged into Issei's boosted gear. Issei issued the transfer command. The circle of blades that had been small expanded across the courtyard and struck several opponents, Cirrus, Ni, Li, Maihi, and Carloman, knocking them out of the match. Ravel Phoenix barely escaped by flying away. A system announcement declared that Lord Riser had retired 1 bishop, 1 rook, 2 knights, and 3 pawns. Their joy at nearly wiping out Lord Riser's peerage was short-lived. Another announcement declared that Lady Rias had lost a queen. All eyes turned upward. Aquino fell from the sky and disappeared. Kiba looked up too late to dodge a bomb-like attack that struck him from behind and took him out as well. A further announcement confirmed that Lady Rias had lost a knight. Issei was stunned by how quickly 2 of his friends had been eliminated and failed to notice Ubeluna preparing another magic bomb. She could not release it, however, because a gleaming white arrow struck her in the chest and detonated in a brilliant light. A system announcement then declared that Lord Riser had lost a queen. Edward's calm voice reached Issei through a magic circle at his ear, telling him to get his head in the game and go to the council room to help Rias defeat Riser. Issei nodded and headed toward the student council room, ignoring the annoyed Ravel Phoenix. When Issei reached the council building, he climbed to the top, where he had been promoted to queen. He found Rias in distress with her clothes torn and Asia desperately trying to heal her while Riser continued his assault. Riser gloatingly noted Issei's arrival and threatened to destroy him in front of Rias. The Phoenix Scion attacked the startled Issei, battering him into the ground. Riser grabbed the new devil by the face and raised a growing ball of fire, declaring that he would burn Rias with it. Rias prepared to call for surrender, but a shimmering water arrow collided with the fireball and extinguished it. They all turned to see a young Irish man holding jade archery. Edward observed that his timing had been perfect. Riser scowled and flung Issei toward Rias and Asia, vowing that Issei would die for the humiliation he had suffered. Edward shrugged off the conflict and, in a playful tone, reminded Riser that he had merely bitten his hand and called it delicious. Then Edward proposed a wager. If Riser won, Edward would become Riser's loyal servant for the rest of his life. Riser demanded to know what Edward wanted in return. Edward offered a bishop, a knight, a rook, and 4 pawns. Riser reacted with disbelief and contempt, refusing to give up part of his peerage to a human he considered weak. Edward taunted him further, letting a holy aura leak from a tear he opened in space and goading Riser by suggesting that the great Riser Phoenix would never dream of losing to a human. Riser accepted the challenge with venom, promising to make Edward scream for mercy and to make those close to him suffer. Edward's expression hardened and lost its earlier mirth. He pushed a sword hilt back into the tear and then opened another, releasing a vast amount of demonic energy. The tip of a spear emerged from the tear and shot forward, nearly piercing Riser's shoulder before Riser leapt aside. The spear retracted, and Edward pulled the rest of it from the tear, closing it behind him. Edward explained that the spear was his family's legacy, a weapon passed down through generations, and that his true family name was not Strauss but. In the viewing room of the rating game, the current heads of both families, 2 of the current Satans, Sona with her peerage, and Sebastian watched as Edward continued to taunt Riser. Lord Phoenix mocked that the human was most likely going to die, his grin sharp as he listened to the wager the Irish child had made. The black-haired golem Sebastian responded that he would not be so sure, explaining that whichever weapon Master Edward chose would determine the fate of Lord Phoenix's son and that either could leave him gravely injured. Phoenix scoffed and demanded why Sebastian believed that. Sebastian only smiled and revealed that one of the 2 weapons in the boy's possession was a holy sword, which caught everyone off guard. Riser's earlier boast about dominating the relationships around Edward added to the tension, and Phoenix taunted that his son would be in mortal danger if Edward chose to be merciful. Surzex pointed out that Phoenix clan regeneration made them nearly impossible to kill, but Sebastian warned that normal regeneration would not work if the clan's core life force was forcibly extracted. The gathered devils stared at him in incredulity while Sona Citri voiced her alarm. Sebastian merely indicated the viewing screen and told them they would soon see. On the screen, a dark magenta spear pulsed in Edward's hands, its surface veined and moving as if alive. Sebastian named it the legacy of his family and indicated that the weapon had been passed down through generations. He began to state his surname before the scene shifted back to the arena. Edward completed his reveal, declaring that his last name was Chulainn. Riser's confident expression faltered as he recognized who he faced. Edward's composure shifted. He taunted Riser about whether he feared him now or the spear he held, spinning the weapon as Rias watched with widening eyes. Rias could sense a dark, unsettling energy emanating from the spear and realized it was the demonic Gibalg. Edward warned that he would not necessarily kill Riser but intended to disable him by targeting a limb, then move the spear. The spearhead detached and darted toward Riser as though it had a will of its own. Riser sprang aside, but the weapon bent and pursued him. In the brief clash that followed, Riser sustained an injury that refused to heal, something his clan's regeneration should have corrected. He could not comprehend how an immortal like him could be affected. The spear then struck, its barbs anchoring into his shoulder. When the weapon withdrew, a fierce wrench of force separated Riser's right arm. He cried out and staggered, visibly weakened, and then he disappeared from the match, unable to continue. The announcer Graphia's voice faltered as she confirmed Lord Riser's retirement and declared Lady Rias the winner. In the viewing room, the The devils reacted with shock at the child who had defeated the favored contender. Reiser's father seethed while Rhea's father regarded the boy with intrigued curiosity. The child announced that he had broken the curse affecting Lord Reiser Phoenix's body. Lady Phoenix asked if he had indeed said curse. Serafal explained that Gibog was a cursed spear. Wounds it caused would not close unless the one who applied the wound released the curse or the spear was destroyed. Surzex questioned how she could know so much about the weapon, and Serafal answered cheerfully that the boy had given her permission to include him in her peerage should he die within a year, a fact she thought she had already mentioned. All eyes turned to the boy, stunned by the implications. Grafia asked the Satan in her stoic voice which piece she would use on him if he died, prompting the Ravenet to withdraw a strange-looking queen piece. Lady Gremory reacted with alarm at the mutated queen piece, and Serafal shook her head and explained that she had tried the other pieces with no response. Only this one had reacted to him, so when he died he would belong to her. The other devils exchanged worried glances at the boy, aware that if he became a devil his power would be formidable. Back in the Occult Research Club room, Rheas and Edward were the only ones left. Rheas, barely injured, studied Edward, who showed no sign of injury and wore the same blank expression as before. Rheas narrowed her eyes and asked if he was Chulainn. Edward nodded, his previous emotions replaced by that distant calm. Edward recounted his past. He explained that his mother had insisted on naming him Edward and had left after his birth. His father had remarried. His stepmother had loved him as if he were her own and wanted him to be the next Fergus, but he could never truly fill that role. As he grew, he realized that he did not understand other children's emotions the way they did. He could feel similar things but could not fully grasp them. He described meeting 3 children when he was 5: Fiona, Diedrich, and Minoli, descendants of Finn Mac Cumhale, Diarmuid Ueduibni, and Queen Medb of Connaught, respectively. They became inseparable. By 13, Minoli and he had developed feelings for each other in a quiet, earnest way that both families approved as a bond to heal old disputes. Fiona and Diedrich had fallen in love as well. The memory of his friends brought a brief ghost of a smile to his face before the expression faded back to the familiar emptiness. He went on to say that when he was 15 they were all together at Minoli's house. He left briefly to make snacks, and when he returned he found that Diedrich and Fiona had been killed in a brutal attack and that a terrible crime had been committed. The horror of the scene shattered something inside him and triggered his sacred gear, Gear Snatcher. Rheas interrupted to ask how Gear Snatcher related to the jade archery he had mentioned earlier. Edward said he would explain that later to Miss Gremory and looked back down. He continued that in response to what he had witnessed, Gear Snatcher reached its balance breaker, named Soul Stealer, and he used it to drag the assailant's soul away and subject it to judgment. The elders later insisted on a trial, so he returned the soul to the body. The accused thrashed in fear before the council, and with Edward as an eyewitness, the man was charged with severe crimes and sent to Dunscaith for punishment. After that night, no matter what his parents tried, Edward found he could not feel the same way as before. He described meeting his biological mother later, who was different but kind and encouraged him to travel and try to forget the past. Before he left, his stepmother explained that her brother's behavior might have stemmed from personal grievances and mentioned she was P-Argent with his little sister, whom he had not yet met. When Rheas asked whether he had ever moved past the pain, Edward shook his head. He said the loss had left him unable to fully heal, but it had also made him capable of wielding one of their ancient weapons. He took that weapon and traveled. For a year before settling where he now lived with Sebastian and others he had gathered since he was 14. Edward stood and moved toward the door, then turned his head slightly to tell Rheas that she was now the 3rd person outside his servants and family to know his story. He suggested she visit the infirmary where her servants were recovering while he needed to go home to retrieve something before collecting his end of a wager at the hospital. At the hospital, Rheas finished checking on Aquino, Kiba, Kaneko, and Issei, who were all recovering well thanks to Asia's twilight healing. As she left the room, she noticed Edward entering the room where Reiser and his peerage were gathered, carrying a briefcase. Curiosity led her to follow him into the Phoenix Scion's room. Carloman demanded to know what the human wanted as Edward entered. He looked over at the beds where Marion, Burent, and Shuria rested, concern briefly showing on his face as he checked that they were all right. Edward admitted that he had shot her and Lady Eubeluna with an arrow of holy energy. The three nodded, and Eubeluna scoffed while grasping her chest in slight pain. A metal stinger gauntlet called Gear Snatcher appeared on Chulainn's right arm. He examined the 3 orbs on the sacred gear, pressed the multicolored one, and an armored glove replaced his current handpiece. He approached the queen, held his hand over her chest, and activated the sacred gear's Glow 2, Healer's Mercy. One piece of the gear glowed bright yellow and Eubeluna's pain faded completely. He dispelled the gear and bowed in apology, explaining that he was sorry for injuring her and that he believed Lord Reiser already knew why he had come. His statement made the peerage stare at their master while Reiser focused on the case in the boy's hand. Reiser acknowledged that he knew why the boy was there and asked what was inside the case, requesting to see it. The boy set the case on a table, opened it, and leaned it up for Reiser and the peerage to see. A collective gasp rose as they all stared at the contents, pure black evil pieces. The boy explained that he had retrieved them from the lair of a stray devil after defeating it, and that a devil had later offered him a place in their peerage, which he had respectfully declined. He then stated that he believed Reiser owed him a bishop, a knight, a rook, and 4 pawns. The girls reacted with a mix of dread and hope. Reiser, seizing his right arm in pain and speaking with great distaste, told the boy to pick who he wanted and then leave. Edward nodded and walked to Chulainn, offering his hand. She accepted it reluctantly while Nell and Isle looked on worriedly. Edward then approached the 2 smaller girls, smiling gently and reassuring them that he would never separate them from the woman they regarded as their mother. The 3 women looked shocked, and Chulainn's composure broke into quiet tears as she pulled the sniffling girls into her arms. Edward watched the tender scene for a moment before moving to Maihi, who took his hand without hesitation. Carloman scoffed and declared that neither she nor Cirrus would ever join him, insisting they were the loyal knights of Lord Reiser. Cirrus rose and walked to Edward's side, surprising Carloman. Cirrus explained that one of them had to go with him and that Lord Reiser had promised the boy a knight. Since Carloman was too loyal to be chosen, Cirrus was the most logical pick. Carloman glared at Edward, but he remained unmoved. When Edward indicated the other 2 pawns, the 2 Nicomeda widened in surprise and nearly objected until Edward offered them all the fish and naps they could ever want. That promise changed their minds instantly. They rose from their beds and fell in behind him. With the pieces chosen, Edward placed the corresponding pieces from the case on the table beside Reiser. Each piece ignited with a small internal flame, signifying that they were now bound to him. Edward thanked Lord Reiser and informed him that, should he enter another raiding game, he could still use those pieces until replacements were found. A pale green magic circle formed beneath them and transported them to Edward's manor. At the manor, 6 servants bowed in unison and welcomed the new arrivals home. The head butler stepped forward to introduce himself as Sebastian Michaelis. Behind him stood Shinra, Lulu, Tsubaki Nakatsukasa, Maka Albern, and Oxford, each offering an appropriate greeting or bow. Sebastian explained that the servants would help them get settled before he introduced the other occupants of the house. He turned to the young twins and asked whether they preferred to share a room or have separate ones. Anai and Lee immediately agreed that they wanted separate rooms. Edward nodded and then looked at the other pair of twins clinging to their mother figure's legs. He asked Chulainn if the girls could sleep in her room. Chulainn accepted and asked him to call her Chulainn. Edward approved and signaled 5 servants to escort them to their new rooms while Sebastian remained. Sebastian handed Edward an envelope, explaining that it had arrived that day and was from his father, who requested that he return to Ireland for up to a week to meet his baby sister and hear about his travels. Edward opened the letter and found 2 round-trip tickets inside. He smiled and asked Sebastian if he would accompany him. Sebastian accepted, saying it would be a privilege to return to his place of origin. He added that Miss Gremory had called to invite Edward to a celebration her household was holding for their recent victory. Sebastian waved his hand and a faint green magic circle formed and flashed, revealing the Gremory group looking puzzled. Issei asked if Edward needed anything, and Aquino chuckled, suggesting in a playful tone that perhaps he wanted to host their celebration at his house. Edward clarified that his family name was Chulainn and asked that they use that name when they were in private. The group nodded and began preparing for the small celebration. As the former members of Riser's peerage and the 3 fallen angels came back downstairs to see what was going on, they took in the small celebration the Gremory group had arranged. With nothing better to do, Donasek, Calawarner, and Middle joined the festivities, while the other devils lingered at the refreshment table and ate, feeling that joining in might dampen the joyful mood. The Gremory group celebrated quietly, the marriage contract was gone and Rias was now free to choose whom she wanted to marry. Rias caught sight of Issei in the corner, laughing and enjoying himself, and she smiled, feeling that it was for the best as she gazed at her beloved pawn. Name, Edward Chulainn. Age, I think, tender. Species, human. Height, 5 feet 7 inches. Weight, 145 pounds. Hair color, black with a blue tint. Eye color, red. Hometown, Waterford, Ireland. Affiliation, none. Status, alive. Occupation, student. Ethnicity, Irish. Birthday, April 4th. Sacred gear. Gear snatcher. Gear snatcher is a sacred gear with the ability to lock, take, steal, and transfer other sacred gears. Its appearance is unremarkable. A thin, segmented metal gauntlet with the hand area open and a long, needle-like protrusion on the middle finger. Each segment bears a small spherical indentation. Lock. This function can disable a sacred gear for a variable duration determined by the user's connection to that gear. Take. This function allows the wielder to take another's sacred gear temporarily. The duration depends on the user's connection. Steal. This function can permanently claim another's sacred gear for the wielder to use. It becomes easier when the connection between a sacred gear and its user is weak. A stolen sacred gear cannot achieve balance breaker. Transfer. This function can transfer a stolen sacred gear to another person or return it to its original owner. A transferred sacred gear can achieve balance breaker once a secure connection is established with its new user. Giebog. Giebog is the demonic spear of the original Chulainn, a powerful weapon passed down through generations. The spear is semi-sentient and attuned to its wielder. As a demonic weapon, it can extend, bend, and twist to strike precise, vital points in an opponent, and its tip is designed so removal becomes difficult and can incapacitate the target. While awaiting its next wielder, it remains in the Shadow Realm Dun Scaith, under the care of the immortal teacher Scathach. The spear appears dark magenta with pulsing black veins along its length. Beneath its tip are small barbs that make it dangerous to confront and hard to dislodge. Other abilities tools. Jade Archery. Jade Archery is a bow-type sacred gear that manifests as a jade green bow. Its user can create arrows of various elements and abilities through imagination. The celebration was in full swing as the Gremory group, Edward, his servants, and the 3 fallen angels mingled. Middle. Kept bowing excessively toward Aquino, a habit that irritated the 3rd year. Kaneko and Edward were clearing sweets and octopus ball from the refreshment table. Kiba had gone to try and strike up a conversation with former members of Riser's peerage, while Asia moved to speak with Calawarner and Donasek. Issei returned from the bathroom feeling queasy after drinking one of Lulu's concoctions and told a nearby friend that he did not understand why Lulu had made that mixture in the first place. As he re-entered the main room, 2 magic circles, one red and one blue, appeared on the floor, and conversations around the room fell silent. When the light from the circles faded, 3 figures stood in the center, a man and 2 women. One of the women was the Gremory head maid, Graphia. The other 2 were unfamiliar to many. The man had dark red hair and the same eye color as Rias. He radiated a presence Issei had never encountered before, and his robes and armor marked him as someone important in the underworld. The other woman had black hair tied into twin tails and purple eyes. She wore an elaborate outfit that made her stand out. Kaneko whispered a sharp command for Issei to kneel, and he snapped out of his small daze. He noticed that everyone, including Edward and the fallen angels, had already knelt toward the newcomers, so he went to his knees as well. Rias rose to speak and formally address the newcomers. Rias asked the red-haired man what had brought him here, and he chuckled softly in response. Issei's mind raced as he realized the man was Rias' brother. The red-haired man asked everyone to stand and explain that he had come to congratulate Rias on her recent victory and to meet her new companions. He added that he had thought the other woman might want to see the human present, and he expressed a desire to meet that human as well. Rias invited Issei and Asia forward for introductions. Asia stepped forward and bowed politely, giving her name and expressing pleasure at the meeting. Issei followed with shaking legs, bowed, and introduced himself in a trembling voice. The red-haired man replied that it was a pleasure to meet them and introduced himself as Surzek's Lucifer, one of the 4 great Satans who ruled the underworld and Rias' older brother. He then motioned to the black-haired woman. The black-haired woman launched forward in a burst of enthusiasm and embraced Edward, swinging him around. She asked excitedly if he had decided to join her peerage yet, repeating the question with boundless energy. Surzek sighed and explained that the woman beside him was Seraphal Leviathan, another great Satan who had been trying to recruit the Irishman for almost a year, though Edward had consistently given the same answer. Edward apologized to Lady Leviathan and reminded her that he had told her before that, should he die in any way other than old age, he would accept reincarnation. A brief, neutral pause in the conversation followed as everyone took. In the reunion, Edward began to apologize that his answer remained unchanged, but before he could finish, Rias smacked him sharply and scolded Chulainn for refusing an invitation to join a Satan's peerage, insisting that it was the opportunity of a lifetime and demanding to know why he would turn it down. Edward met her with cold eyes and explained that he wanted to remain human for as long as he could, hopefully for the rest of his life, and that Lady Leviathan had been the one to propose the idea. Seraphal nodded, pouting at the grimoire air and reminding Rias that she had come up with the plan and kept forgetting it, so they should not be hard on Edward. Surzek thanked Edward for protecting his sister and added that, if not for him, Rias might have been forced into an unwanted marriage. Edward shook his head and insisted that Issei could have defeated Lord Riser without his last-minute intervention. The comment sent everyone to stare at the trembling pawn as he glanced around, avoiding their eyes. Surzek asked what had led Edward to that conclusion, and Edward grabbed the brunette's arm to explain that he believed Issei had given up the use of his left arm to the dragon within the boosted gear to gain a temporary balance breaker. At that moment the gauntlet of the boosted gear materialized and its gem began to flash. The voice of the Red Dragon Emperor issued from the gear to confirm that Issei's partner had indeed relinquished his left arm to gain greater power, though he had apparently forgotten about that enhancement during his one-sided fight with the Phoenix. Everyone went quiet at the unexpected voice, and the Red Dragon Emperor smiled and told Issei that it was understandable to forget in the heat of battle, but warned him not to let it happen again. Issei nodded so quickly it seemed comical. Surzek suggested that they should leave before Falbium and Ajuka became upset at being left behind, and Seraphal objected, pointing toward the fallen Calawarner, Donasik, and Middlet gathered by the refreshment table. Surzek shook his head and explained that confronting them risked losing Edward, since he believed those 3 were Edward's guests. Edward confirmed the suspicion with a nod. Rias then strode over and fixed the 3 fallen with a fierce glare, promising that if they harmed so much as a hair on Edward's head she would destroy them. The 3 fallen nodded fearfully before masking their fear with casual expressions, and the group prepared to depart in silence. Maihi declared that the party was effectively over and excused herself. Others murmured their goodnights and headed to their rooms. Before the magic circle that would take the Grimoire party away could activate, Edward stopped them to ask Rias to inform Miss Citri that he would be absent from school that week because he planned to visit Ireland. Rias agreed and activated the circle, leaving Chulainn in the cluttered room. Edward turned to his butler and asked whether their bags were packed and ready for the morning. Sebastian confirmed that the luggage was in the car trunk so they could depart for the airport first thing. Edward explained that, while he and Sebastian were away, Shinra would be in charge and the household should follow the chain of command if anything happened. The golems and servants acknowledged the order, and Edward instructed them to clean the room. They set to work immediately. 1 week later, Issei groaned as the other members of the Occult Research Club flipped through old photos of him as a child, a consequence of Rias having moved in after the confrontation with Riser. He reddened under the teasing attention until Kiba approached with a book containing a picture of himself and his old friend Irina. Kiba pointed to an ornately sheathed sword in the background and asked Issei what it was. Issei said he thought it was merely a decorative sword from Irina's family, and Kiba's expression darkened. Kiba then made it clear that the sheath was not just decoration but belonged to a genuine holy sword, and he thanked Issei for reminding him of what he needed to do. With that, Kiba left the clubroom determined, leaving Issei and Asia to look on in concern. Rias bit her nail in frustration and then began to tell them about how she had found Kiba. He, his twin sister, and several others had been subjected to an illegal church program called the Holy Sword Project. The program had failed, and the aftermath had been brutal. Some of the other subjects had tried to help Kiba and his sister escape that ordeal, but the damage left them bearing deep scars. Yet, he was the only one to escape and was about to die in the cold until she had found him and given him a new purpose in her peerage. Rias admitted that she had thought he might have forgotten by now, but it seemed he still remembered and still held a grudge. Asia covered her mouth in horror and protested that the church would never do something like that. Rias clarified that it had not been the church but the rogue exorcist Valper Galilee, the genocide archbishop. She looked at the ground with sorrow, wanting to help Kiba, but acknowledging that this was something he would have to face himself. Kiba was seething and needed to vent. He scanned for anything to take his anger out on until he heard a familiar, crazed laughter. The blonde ran toward the sound and turned a corner to find Fried Selzen, one of the conspirators involved in Asia's suffering, facing off against someone else. The man in front of Fried looked familiar and disturbingly hollow. Edward, the black-haired Irishman recently returned from Ireland, whose eyes were more lifeless than before. Fried drew a holy sword and taunted that he had found a lost soul and would end him with Excalibur. The blade slashed down in a blur toward Edward's chest, but Edward caught the fragment bare-handed before it struck him. Fried stumbled back, staring at the hand that had stopped the sword. The hand showed signs of injury from the contact. Startled, Fried decided to retreat for the moment, warning that he would kill Edward when he next had the chance, and then fled at terrifying speed. When Fried disappeared, Kiba stepped forward to check on his friend, who did not seem to be in the best condition. Edward greeted Kiba, Yuto, in the same flat tone as his eyes. Kiba flinched and replied that they had been fine, but the Excalibur fragments appeared to have been stolen. Edward confirmed this and then looked toward the direction Fried had run. He told Kiba that he would be going home and would see him at the school tomorrow. Kiba, confused, pointed out that it was Sunday and there was no school the next day. Edward explained that he did not mean literal school attendance. If Excalibur fragments were present in the area, the church would likely send someone to retrieve them, and they might request an audience with Rias. With that, Edward walked away and vanished as a green magic circle appeared beneath him, teleporting him home. Kiba scratched his head, puzzled until his phone buzzed. It was a message from Issei inviting him to meet in the park in 5 minutes and promising a surprise that would shake his world. Kiba shook his head, mildly annoyed, and wondered what could be so significant. Issei thought the day could not get any worse as he, Rias, and Asia walked back to his house, still worried about Kiba. When they reached the house, they sensed 3 strong holy presences inside and grew uneasy, but Issei urged them to go in and confront whatever was happening. He opened the door to find 2 cloaked figures and a girl with light brown hair tied into long twin tails speaking with his mother. The girl noticed them, turned, and ran forward to hug Issei with bright enthusiasm. Issei was momentarily confused and asked who she was. The girl pouted and said she could not believe he had forgotten his childhood friend. Issei's memory clicked and he recognized her as Irina. He admitted that he had not expected to see her like this, and Irina explained that she had been more of a tomboy when she was younger. Issei's mother responded with mild disapproval at his forgetfulness. Irina smiled and insisted she had changed and seemed pleased to be back. Issei grew tense when he realized she was an exorcist, which helped explain some of the differences he was noticing. Issei asked about her companions. Irina introduced her friends from the church. One of them pulled back her hood to reveal blue hair with a green streak. Zenobia Quarta introduced herself formally. Her greeting sounded strained and she glared at Issei, Rias, and Asia with obvious distrust. Mariah introduced herself as Mariah Mayers and asked to be called Mariah. When she removed her hood, the 3 Kuoh students gasped at the sight of the exorcist. They all thought she looked like a female Kiba. One of the students asked if Mariah had a brother and whether he had been her twin. Mariah's smiling face fell as she looked at the ground and said that she had a brother, but he had died a long time ago and they had never been able to find his body. Issei felt a flicker of suspicion and looked toward his mother with a hopeful expression. He asked his mother if she needed anything from the store for dinner that night. She tapped her chin, then asked him to pick up more rice and frying oil because they were having pork cutlet that evening. Issei suggested that Irina and her friends stay for dinner, and his mother brightened at the idea. Zenobia began to protest, but Irina gripped her shoulder and warned that once someone entered their home for dinner they would not leave until they had eaten. Issei celebrated internally that his plan had worked. He asked Mariah if she would help him get the rice and frying oil from the store. Mariah agreed gratefully, and the two left the house in a flash. As they walked down the street, Mariah looked at Issei with slight apprehension and asked what he intended to do now. Issei assured her that he would not do anything she did not want and explained that they were only going to the park so she could meet someone he knew. They reached the dark, quiet park and Issei called out for Kiba, announcing that he had a surprise. A faint rustling in the bushes announced the blonde knight, who emerged with irritation until he saw that Issei's surprise was someone he never expected to see again. Kiba recognized Mariah and was shocked. Mariah also recognized him and began to cry out his name. The two ran toward each other and hugged tightly. Kiba said that he had thought she was gone, and Mariah explained that the church had arrived at the last minute to rescue her before things became fatal, though an archbishop named Valper had escaped. She spoke of Valper with so much spite that Kiba doubted she sounded like the exorcist he knew. Mariah added that none of that mattered now, because they were reunited and nothing could split them apart, and she still considered him her big brother despite his being a devil. Kiba corrected her with a small smile and said he was only older by a few minutes and that his new name was Yudo Kiba. He thanked Issei for bringing him to his little sister and offered his eternal gratitude. Issei said it had been nothing, that he had been helping a friend on a hunch, and suggested they head back before his mother became suspicious. The three parted ways. Kiba and Mariah exchanged phone numbers and promised to catch up later. Issei dashed into a small shop and returned with a moderately large bag of rice and a bottle of frying oil. With the items in hand, he and Mariah walked back to his home. Once inside, Irina and Zenobia quickly took Mariah away while giving Issei a scathing look. He sighed quietly and handed the rice and oil to his mother so she could begin cooking. Time skip, the next day. Rias and her group sat in the occult research club room as 3 female exorcists stood before them. Edward had texted Issei that he would arrive soon but had not specified exactly when. The atmosphere felt tense because of the palpable strain between the brunette exorcist and Rias. Rias cleared her throat and asked why 3 members of the church were in her territory. Zenobia stared at the devil heiress with barely contained hostility and explained that they had come because 3 fragments of Excalibur had been stolen from the church by fallen angels. Issei, puzzled, asked about Excalibur fragments and noted that he thought Excalibur had been a single sword. Irina, smiling slightly, explained that it was not widely known, but during the Great War Excalibur had indeed been one sword before being broken into 7 pieces. Excalibur Destruction, Excalibur Mimic, Excalibur Rapidly, Excalibur Nightmare, Excalibur Transparency, Excalibur Blessing, and Excalibur Ruler. Each fragment retained a portion of the original power, but Excalibur Ruler remained unlocated, preventing the sword from being fully reassembled. Irina then indicated a string tied on her arm and revealed that it was Excalibur Mimic, capable of transforming into any weapon or material she desired. Mariah showed a decorative sheathed sword at her hip and explained that it was Excalibur Blessing, which could weaken devils and strengthen exorcists. Zenobia scowled and demanded why they were sharing this information when the others were technically the enemy. Irina replied with a confident, almost dismissive tone that Rias and her group would not interfere because doing so could spark another war. Zenobia then asked whether Irina did not want them to interfere with the mission. Rias questioned with growing annoyance why they would trust the devils, given that they were devils and the church's greatest weapons were missing. The blue-haired exorcist countered with a smug, taunting look, suggesting that it made sense to suspect the devils would collude with the church. The king slammed her hands onto the desk, stood, and glared, declaring that the Gremory clan would never betray its honor and putting her own name and honor on the line. Zenobia chuckled and was about to further provoke the Gremory heiress when an Irish man interrupted, calling the blue-haired woman merely a power idiot and asking for confirmation from Miss Corda. The interruption drew everyone's attention. The king demanded to know what he was doing there and whether he was a devil. The Irish man denied being a devil and performed a short prayer to prove it, asking the Lord to allow Issei Hayadu to find the romantic happiness he sought. Issei reacted with mild irritation, questioning his friend's choice of words. The Irishman admitted he had done it to make a point and get a cheap laugh at the power idiot. He then demanded Chulainn Solace, insisting it belonged to the church. Edward shook his head and explained that the sword belonged to the Celts by origin and that the church had taken it because it was a holy sword. Zenobia scowled at the Ravenet in exasperation. Irina told Mariah that they were leaving, but Zenobia noticed Asia and asked if she was the former holy maiden, Asia Argento. The two ex-nuns turned to look. Irina commented that she had not expected a former holy maiden to become a devil. The insult irritated the devils. A faint holy light pulsed nearby, and Asia answered that she still believed in God, explaining why. When she finished, Zenobia drew Excalibur Destruction and pointed it at Asia, declaring that she would kill Asia and pray for her soul. Before Zenobia could strike, a blinding silver blade flashed and intercepted the attack, stopping Zenobia cold. The Irishman taunted that the power idiot should not be hasty and proposed a fair fight for Chulainn Solace instead of killing a defenseless magic caster. Zenobia sheathed her weapon and withdrew as the three exorcists left the building. With the exorcists gone, all eyes turned to the holy sword in Edward's hand. Asia smiled brightly and asked Edward how he had come into possession of Chulainn Solace and how his trip to Ireland had gone, whether his family had been happy to see him. The light in his eyes vanished as he replied that the story of how he acquired the sword would be told another day and that his trip to Ireland had been uneventful. He excused himself and left in a flash of green light, departing suddenly and leaving the Gremory group stunned. Asia, puzzled, wondered aloud whether she had said something wrong as she looked toward where Chulainn had been. Chulainn Solace. This is a powerful holy sword from Irish folklore kept in the possession of the church. It is particular about who wields it, and the sword itself has a vain personality that insists on being kept pristine. Chulainn Solace is a broadsword with a dark cerulean handle and a decorative golden guard featuring 6 dragons' teeth, a large emerald, and dark crimson markings on the 6 protrusions. The blade is bright silver with golden markings along its flat. The sword's power increases with the wielder's skill, making it a dangerous weapon in the hands of a practiced swordsman. A couple of days had passed since the devils had met with the 3 exorcists, and the exorcists had not been seen since. Edward also remained distant. Kiba saw him in class, but a palpable aura of depression surrounded Edward and pushed everyone who could not resist it away. Kiba wanted to help his friend but hesitated to intrude on his personal life. Kiba glanced left and saw Edward slowly eating his octopus dumplings, as he usually did in class, snacking and paying attention to the lesson. Even so, it was obvious something bad had happened to him, and most students avoided him to prevent provoking or upsetting him. When the final bell rang, Edward stood and walked over to Kiba's desk. Edward asked what Kiba was going to do, and his question left Kiba confused at first. Edward pressed the matter more directly, asking what Kiba intended to do about the stolen Excalibur fragments that were still at large. Edward asked whether Kiba would sit idly by while the fragments were used for whatever Freed planned, or whether he would help the exorcists find them and avenge their fallen comrades. With that statement, Edward walked away, leaving Kiba to mull over the words. Kiba made up his mind, pulled out his phone, and sent Issei a text inviting him to meet at the nearby cafe with the good parfaits. He then stood, left the classroom, and headed for the school entrance. Unseen by him, 2 figures stood behind a tree watching his departure. At the open-air cafe, Kiba waited for Issei. After a few minutes, Issei arrived and began to look around. Kiba informed Issei that they were going to help the exorcists recover the Excalibur fragments. Issei hesitated, concerned about the danger, but after thinking it over he reluctantly agreed to assist with the mission. A voice from above announced that Sona and Rias had been right to have them followed, and the group looked up to see Sona's new pawn, Genshuru Saji, and next to him, eating a chocolate parfait, the white-haired rook, Kaneko. Issei gave a nervous chuckle and looked away from the servants. Saji asked whether they should report this to Sona and Rias, but Kaneko had already descended the stairs and approached them. Saji called for her to wait, then hurried down and stood beside her. Kaneko stated that plans had changed and that they were going to help find the exorcists. Saji reacted with shock and alarm, worrying about their master's punishment. Kiba gave Saji a sympathetic smile and asked what he preferred, letting Kokobile start another great conflict by killing their masters, or preventing that and earning praise from their superiors. That thought steadied Saji, and he agreed to join. He then asked what their first move would be. The knight replied that their first priority should be to find the exorcists and make a truce. As he spoke, Kaneko pointed toward a burger place across the street where the exorcists were seated, and Kiba noted that they had an unknown ally helping them in this quest. The group of devils crossed the street and entered the restaurant. Inside, Mariah turned at the sound of the door and saw her brother and 3 devils. She called Kiba over and said that Edward would buy them something to eat. The other 2 exorcists, Irina and Zenobia, looked back and recognized the devils. Irina was happy to see Issei again, while Zenobia responded with suspicion, asking if they were there to attack while the exorcists were at their weakest. Issei, confused, asked Edward why he was paying for their meal and wondered whether the exorcists had their own money. Edward explained that he had been searching this part of Kuoh for leads on the Excalibur fragments when he came across the 3 exorcists appearing to ask for money. His face briefly tried to form a smile and then returned to its usual stoic expression as he recounted how he had decided to follow up on the situation. Mariah informed them that Zenovia's childhood friend had spent all of her money on a fake portrait of a saint. The friend flushed deeply and looked down at the table in embarrassment, insisting that it was not her fault because the man selling it had seemed kind and honest. Zenobia shook her head at her friend's lack of sense and turned back toward the devils to ask why they were there and whether they intended to fight or had another purpose. The Knight of Gremory explained that they had come to request a temporary truce until the Excalibur fragments were returned to the Excalibur wielder, and that they wished to help search for the fragments as well. The Holy Sword wielder considered the proposal. Zenovia's blonde companion then prodded her shoulder and urged accepting the help, arguing that cooperation would increase their chances and that the church would not be harmed by what it did not know. Zenobia looked at Mariah with a raised brow and asked if there was any other reason she wanted to team up with the devils. Mariah quickly nodded and pointed at Kiba, saying that the man behind him was her twin brother Isaiah, whom they had believed dead, and adding that they could use the extra help because Irina had wasted much of their money. The brunette exorcist reddened at the reminder of that mistake. The power idiot continued eating, however, and the others were told to finish the meal first. A mischievous glint appeared in the supposed thief's eyes as he announced that he would not be spending his money. He revealed that the money he was using had come from a bribe Lady Leviathan had attempted to use to recruit him into her peerage, so the meal was being paid for by one of the 4 great Satans. The Bluinette dropped her burger in fury and vowed to get him back, while Edward watched with mild amusement. Later that night the group walked through the woods toward the location where Kaneko's familiar had detected a holy energy signature. Zenobia and Edward led the way. Kiba and Mariah followed behind, trying to catch up on each other's pasts. Issei and Irina walked in awkward silence, and Kaneko and Saji brought up the rear. Irina broke the quiet by asking Issei why he had become a devil. Issei paused, then explained that Rias had saved him. He said that a fallen angel named Heir had attacked and left him for dead because of the boosted gear, and that Rias had intervened and changed his path. Irina's face fell with sorrow at not having been there for him, and Issei noticed her sadness and quickly shifted the conversation to ask what life had been like for her in Europe. Irina brightened and began to describe her life and the church. At the front of the group, Zenobia asked Edward why he would not join the church, noting his strength and natural ability to wield holy swords and reminding him that he had gained Lady Gabriel's favor. Edward looked up at the stars, reflecting that if he had done what many in the church had asked of him, he would have missed many of the experiences and friendships he had found in Kuoh. Zenobia bristled and said that those friends were all devils who only wanted his strength. Edward countered that the church was not free of the same motives and that many people there wanted him for his power. He clarified that he did not speak of heaven itself, but that most people acted from very human reasons. They reached the source of the signature. Edward drew the sword of light from its scabbard and pointed into the woods, warning that they should prepare for a fight because the energy leak made it impossible to approach unnoticed. A crazed laugh echoed through the trees. Freed Selzen stepped out, pointing Excalibur back at them and berating them for bringing exorcists and devils. Kiba tightened his grip on his sword and Issei clenched his gauntlet-covered hand as the tension snapped into action. Zenobia announced that Freed Selzen was to be captured for transgressions against the church, to be brought before them, and that the Excalibur fragments stolen by Freed and the fallen angels were to be reclaimed. The rogue exorcist burst into laughter at the declaration, and the others tensed as slow clapping echoed from above. Valper Galilei then taunted them, mocking the sight of 3 girls wielding Excalibur fragments and noting, with a self-satisfied tone, that the church had used his research on the holy vectors. Kiba and Mariah froze in rage and looked up to the roof, where a portly man dressed like an archbishop stood grinning. The angry blonde exorcist charged at Valper Galilei and accused him of causing suffering to innocents, but she was stopped mid-run by a spear of light. 2 fallen angels hovered to the criminal's right, wearing mocking expressions. Valper declared that the 2 young women were survivors of one of his projects, referring to one who had escaped and one who had watched her comrades die. He said he had no time to waste and ordered the fallen to handle the others, calling Freed to come because he had work to do. Freed, the white-haired man, gave the group a crazed smile, made a rude gesture, and ran. Mariah called out and threw off her cloak to reveal combat attire beneath. Zenobia and Irina followed suit and pursued the rogue exorcists with Kiba. Their departure left Issei, Saji, Kaneko, and Edward to face the 2 fallen angels. The 2 fallen made a threatening move toward the girls, but before they could act, a magenta spear flashed across the sky and struck their wings, forcing them down in a sudden fall. The 3 devils turned to see Edward holding a spear that pierced the fallen angel's wings. He stepped forward, drew a silver short sword etched with gold, and placed the blade at one fallen's throat as the etchings began to glow. Edward demanded to know whom they served. One of the fallen smirked and named Kokabeel, prompting his companion to panic. The companion stammered that he had meant to name Azazel, but the truth had been forced out of him. The child of light asked what Kokabeel intended, and the fallen, unable to keep silent, confessed that Kokabeel planned to start another great war. Edward then knocked both fallen unconscious, withdrew the spear from their wings, and told the others they should inform Miss Gremory and Miss Citri immediately. Issei and Saji stiffened when their kings and queens appeared. Rias and Sona demanded what Edward meant, and Edward explained that he had used the ability of Fragarak to force the truth from those with the blade at their throats. With that reasonable explanation accepted, the 2 high-class devils postponed the punishments for their servants. Later, Issei received a call from Mariah. She reported that she and Irina were at the school and that Irina was badly injured, adding that Freed had taken Excalibur mimic and was attempting to forge an incomplete Excalibur. Issei relayed the news, and Rias and Sona summoned their peerages to the school. The present group teleported there to find Asia already attending to Irina, healing her while Mariah stood nearby with an unsheathed Excalibur blessing sword to help speed the recovery. Sona asked Asia if Irina was stable enough to move. Asia confirmed that she was, and instructed Tsubaki to take Irina to the student council room and ensure she was safe. Tsubaki complied and carried Irina away. The rest of the peerages arrived and prepared to follow their leader's orders. As the queen stepped out of sight, a bright pillar of light appeared and drew everyone's attention upward. Kokabeel announced that the catalysts of war had arrived and that he could finally begin his plans. Rias demanded why he would want to instigate another great war that would benefit no one. Kokabeel laughed and admitted, with a bored tone, that he intended to start a war because he was tired of nothing interesting happening. The group fell silent in stunned disbelief at that explanation. Edward asked for confirmation, and Kokabeel gleefully explained that since nothing STMLTNG had occurred since the last conflict, and because Azazel was only occupied with sacred gear research, he had decided to provoke chaos. He revealed his plan to target the sisters of two of the great Satans and to steal the Excalibur fragments from the church. Kokabeel snapped his fingers, and 3 red magic circles appeared. When the flash subsided, 3 Cerberus stood before them. Aquino stated that those were Cerberi and that they were supposed to be guarding the gates of the underworld as she looked at the growling heads of the massive dogs beginning to charge at the devils and the human. They jumped back to avoid the snapping jaws while Rias unleashed her power of destruction. The effect on the beasts seemed minimal. They pressed forward, trying to snatch one in their mouths. One of the beasts was about to strike down the Citri heiress's knight when a blonde blur intervened. Kiba arrived holding his holy eraser and explained that he had been late because he needed to find someone and bring them here. Edward's yell announced Zenovia's arrival as she crashed down onto a Cerberus with Excalibur destruction. The blade's impact obliterated the beast and left a small crater. She dusted herself off, only to be surprised by another Cerberus approaching from behind. Zenovia sliced it through in a swift motion, stopping it instantly. The Bluenet noticed Edward flick traces of the creature's life force from Cleum Solace. Kiba and Mariah moved into the woods to find Freed and Valper, leaving the rest to focus on Kokabeel, who sat high above them in a floating throne and regarded them with a mocking expression. After the last Cerberus fell, everyone turned their full attention to the Cadre-class fallen angel. Issei glared with intense hatred and felt his anger grow as he watched Kokabeel. A tap on his shoulder revealed Edward, the Child of Light, who reminded him of something he had forgotten from his match with Lord Riser. Realization hit Issei, and he raised the boosted gear to charge for a dragon shot. Issei channeled the boosts. A ball of energy formed beside his hand. He struck it with a punch, releasing a beam that blasted toward Kokabeel. The beam struck, producing a massive explosion that forced everyone to shield their eyes. When the dust cleared, Kokabeel's throne was destroyed, but he remained unharmed. Kokabeel announced that he had changed his mind about a quick kill and intended to make them suffer horribly. He formed several spears of light aimed at the students and prepared to finish them when a burst of holy energy came from the woods. Kokabeel then revealed that he had prepared a magic circle powerful enough to destroy the town. He explained that the incomplete Excalibur's residual energy had shortened the circle's charge from an hour to only 20 minutes. Sona narrowed her eyes and demanded to know what Kokabeel meant. Kokabeel, smiling like a crazed warmonger, detailed his plan to annihilate the town and begin another great war. Hearing this, Issei's thoughts raced with the names of his parents, Motohama, Matsuda, and everyone else who would be caught in the blast. Enraged, he advanced with the boosted gear glowing on his arm and asked Drake whether he could use the temporary balance breaker now. Drake replied that it should be possible but reminded him the time limit was still 10 seconds and questioned whether Issei could hold off a being that had witnessed the Great War for that long. Issei nodded, determined to not only hold Kokabeel off but to defeat him within those 10 seconds. Kokabeel laughed and vowed to crush that hope and destroy the town to start the Second Great War. Edward grabbed Issei's gauntlet one more time and advised him to fight not with rage but with the purpose of protecting his family, friends, and master. Issei acknowledged the counsel, and Edward released the boosted gear. A faint purple glow dissipated from where Edward had touched it. Issei returned a confident grin and a thumbs up to his friend before turning back to Kokabeel with the gauntlet raised. Issei called on Drake to activate Overbooster and leapt into the air as the jewel of the boosted gear glowed. A bright light surrounded him as the temporary balance breaker manifested as scale mail across his body. Drake began to respond, then paused in surprise, revealing that something unexpected had happened. The time limit had somehow expanded. Issei worried that the scale mail might have a problem, but Drake reacted with the delight of someone witnessing a miracle and confirmed the extra time. An announcement gave them 10 minutes to defeat the crow. The reincarnated devil, Issei, was surprised by the news but smirked beneath his helmet and decided to use the situation to his advantage. He activated the jets on his back and shot upward to strike the fallen general. His fist connected, but Kokabeel barely moved from his position. Edward warned that Kokabeel now had a reasonable handicap and suggested that Issei take advantage of it before the general recovered. Edward then turned toward the source of a destructive spell and took off in a light sprint. At that moment, Bog's magenta spearhead struck one of Kokabeel's wings and forced the warmonger to stagger with a pained cry. The spearhead then slid back into the polearm as the current child of light sheathed the demonic weapon. Issei smirked under his helmet at Kokabeel's glare and vowed that he would not waste the opportunity. He reactivated his jets and pulled his fist back. Kokabeel braced to swing, summoning light spears behind him aimed at the Red Dragon Emperor. The pawn declared that this would end now as he and the fallen angel launched their attack against Kokabeel. Fragarak. Fragarak was an ancient Celtic sword said to choose its wielders by three qualities: a heart of gold, an unshakable will, and the pain of loss. Wielders who matched those traits were rare. While it waited for a worthy bearer, it was kept within Dun's Skaith, safeguarded in a vault by Skathak. Fragarak was a gleaming silver shortsword with a black hilt and a standard guard. On the flat of the blade 3 runes were etched in gold, one for truth, another for strength, and the last for wind. These runes spoke to the sword's powers: the ability to pierce defenses, to grant the wielder control over the wind, and to compel honesty from those who stood before it. As a battle between the fallen angel general and the Red Dragon Emperor raged above, Edward remained focused on his mission to locate and neutralize a destructive spell. When he finally reached the enormous magic circle, he paused at the sight of its scale. Edward summoned his own magic to create a series of steps and climbed up to inspect the ritual from above. He noted aloud to himself that it would be far harder than he had first thought, and that the circle appeared flawlessly constructed. The realization irritated him. There was nothing obvious to exploit. He considered his options: trigger the spell early and try to contain the blast, or attempt to alter symbols and risk making the ritual worse. A rustling to his left made him turn. He looked toward the wall of the kendo club, at the side with the dressing room. Edward called out that he would explain what was happening if anyone came forward, but no one appeared. He assumed it had been an animal and kept his attention on the circle. Just as he was about to touch one of the symbols, a voice from above told him that he could use some help, addressing him as Chulainn. Edward looked up, narrowing his eyes, and demanded to know what Valley was doing here. Valley hovered in white armor set with blue jewels above him. Kiba and Mariah had finally found where the 2 Rouge exorcists were hiding, but they arrived too late. The incomplete Excalibur had already been formed and was being used against them. Freed wielded the unfinished sword and combined the aspects of rapidity and transparency, creating a terrifying pattern where neither sibling could predict the next strike. Mariah told herself and Kiba that they were getting nowhere and that at the rate they were going they might die. Kiba, however, insisted they could still win if they stayed together and raised his sword to block an overhead slash from the incomplete Excalibur. Mariah swung blessings upward where she believed the wielder stood. Her strike revealed Freed's position and caused him to reappear. Freed snarled at the devil and demanded how his presence had been detected. Kiba smirked and remarked that Edward had been right. Freed gave off too much chaos for a proper sneak attack. The comment enraged Freed, who dashed with unnerving speed and struck downward at the devil, catching Kiba off guard. Kiba managed a narrow block with Excalibur blessings. Mariah warned her brother not to become overconfident, and her defense held long enough for Kiba to jump back. Freed disengaged and vanished once more. Kiba thanked his sister in a glance, then saw Freed coming in for another attack aimed at Mariah. He pushed her out of the way, but Freed's weapon rippled out of existence and then struck. Kiba felt a sharp, painful impact along his back. Mariah cried out and staggered to her feet, only to be knocked by a phantasmic form of her brother created by Freed. Freed taunted that finally the pair had stopped moving, preparing to press his advantage, when Valper interrupted. Valper, smiling with a sinister calm, told the twins that he wanted to watch them drown in despair. He produced a blue crystal, threw it, and as it broke into 2 pieces, a subtle dread settled over the devil and the exorcist. Valper explained that the fragments contained the holy vectors of comrades who had died trying to save them and invited the twins to look upon what that had brought their friends. The sight triggered grief in Kuoh and Mariah. Kuoh and Mariah both thought they were sorry that they had been unable to help their friends. The two crystal halves glowed and separated into small orbs of light that soon took the shape of their fallen comrades. Kuoh and Mariah were overwhelmed by the sudden reappearance of those forms and reacted with sorrow and regret. Kuoh wondered if it was even worth being alive, surprising his sister, who widened her eyes in shock. The gathered spirits' friends who had died reassured them that everything would be all right and begged the two siblings to live. The spirits told them they might not be able to do much alone, but together they could succeed. They had accepted the holy sword and were not afraid. Even if there was no God watching over them, their hearts would remain united. The spirits united into a single voice and the feeling of one purpose flowed into Kuoh and Mariah. The spirits flowed into Kuoh and Mariah, and energy burst outward around them. Valper glared up at the two and summoned a powerful technique, invoking balance break. A new sword formed in his hands, crackling with a black and white aura. He declared that he would end them with a blade that combined holy power and devil magic. Fried smirked and raised his incomplete Excalibur in preparation, but a surge of power came from Mariah as she sheathed Excalibur blessings. Fried reacted with disbelief and anger at Mariah's unexpected power, insisting he would still kill them. Mariah returned his glare and, with a magic circle forming at her feet, called to those who had defended their king and spread his name across Europe. She said she wielded a blade in the king's name, and a sword bathed in light rose from the circle into her hands joyous. Valper stared in shock. Mariah explained that the Vatican had found safer ways to create artificial wielders and had expanded on earlier research, producing joyous. She added that Zenobia and Irina were natural-born wielders. With that, Mariah charged the old man but was intercepted by Fried. Fried struck wildly at Mariah, who dodged and blocked with ease. He cursed and demanded she stay still, while Mariah taunted him about his foul language and wondered how he had become an exorcist. Her taunts bought Kuoh time to prepare a counterattack. Kuoh and Fried locked their blades. Fried's incomplete Excalibur against Kuoh's true holy sword, and Mariah brought Joyeuse down in a diagonal slash with incredible speed. The rogue exorcist jumped back and raised the Excalibur to block, but the tip of the incomplete blade cracked under the strength of the true holy sword. Fried shouted at the damage to his sword, but before he could recover, Kuoh's balance breaker shattered the rest of the incomplete Excalibur. Mariah followed with a precise drop kick that sent Fried unconscious. Mariah announced that Fried was out of the picture and that they would now deal with Valper. As the twins stalked toward the rotund archbishop, the others watched. Valper suddenly cried out that he finally understood. The balance between good and evil had been broken. He began to say that this meant consequences for both the four devil kings and even God, but his words were cut short when a spear of light descended and struck him, knocking him down and leaving him motionless. Kokobiel's voice came from above, complimenting Valper's intellect and regretting not eliminating him sooner. Kokobiel then rushed at an exhausted Issei and slammed him into the ground, which broke the temporary balance breaker. The fallen angel general smirked down at those below and prepared to descend. Mariah held Joyeuse aloft and unleashed a burst of light to temporarily blind Kokobiel, giving the others a moment to prepare. A magic seal appeared by Zenobia as she began a chant invoking saints and asking for aid. A chained blade emerged, and when her hand touched it the chains shattered, allowing her to draw a blue broadsword Durandal. Kokobiel continued his descent, striking her and sending her and the sword tumbling to the side. He taunted that Durandal was only as strong as its wielder and then turned to grab the sword of the betrayer that Kuoh had swung at him. Kokobiel grunted in pain when a kick landed on his wing and forced him to release the sword. Mariah quickly jumped back, drawing Kokobiel's attention and giving Zenobia a chance to approach from behind him. At the last second Kokobiel twisted aside, but a thin nick appeared on his cheek. Kokobiel smirked and told them they were rather persistent for people who had lost their leader. The three swordsmen tightened their guard while the others were tended to by Asia. Zenobia tightened her grip on her holy sword and demanded to know what he meant, and Mariah looked on in confusion. Kokobiel's grin widened as he leaned in and revealed a secret: God was dead. The statement left them all stunned as they stared at the cadre-class fallen angel in disbelief. Kokobiel explained that it was not only the 4 devil kings who had perished in the First Great War, God had been killed as well. The 3 factions had kept the truth from humanity, he said, with only the top brass aware of the real events. The knight looked down, numb, wondering what they had been believing as they wasted their lives in the facility. Zenobia shook her head in denial, refusing to accept it. Kokobiel scoffed and ranted that another war would not happen unless someone schemed to start one, recalling that Azazel had proclaimed there would be no second war and that it had seemed to settle matters. He seethed that if the fallen angels could take over, they would no longer have to rely on weak humans. Asia sank to her knees in despair and then fainted when she could no longer bear the revelation. The others rushed to her side, calling her name and collapsing to their knees in panic. Issei shouted for Kokobiel to leave Asia out of it, stepping forward to intervene. He declared that he would not let the threat of war interfere with his own. Kokobiel chuckled and pushed Issei aside, taunting the group that the magic circle was primed and ready and that they should say goodbye to their hopes. He snapped his fingers and a small explosion went off in the woods near the school, far less than he had expected. A voice from above interrupted him. A man in blue-jeweled white armor with wings of blue light hovered overhead. Kokobiel lashed out at the flying figure, but the wings in the newcomer's hand were nothing like Azazel's, and Kokobiel watched in disbelief as his own wings were rendered useless. The man in white scale mail taunted that a being fallen so low had no need for wings, then threw the feathers aside and launched himself forward to strike Kokobiel. Each time a blow connected, the man called out "Divide," and the fallen angel felt his energy drain away, his knees weakening under the steady onslaught. After several minutes of being pummeled and having his energy sapped, Kokobiel finally lost consciousness. The White Dragon Emperor declared that his work was done and that he would take Freed along to be questioned. He seized both the rogue exorcist and the fallen general and flew away, then addressed Issei, telling him that he expected him to become stronger so that he would have a real chance when the true fight came. With that he vanished into the night sky. Draig told Issei that the man he had just seen was the vanishing dragon, Albion, and that Albion would be his rival. Draig warned that in his current state Issei was nowhere close to being able to defeat him. Issei nodded, determined to grow stronger and to one day defeat his rival. Edward, soot-covered and wind-blown, emerged from the woods and asked if the fight was already over. Sona pushed her glasses up and asked what had happened to him. Edward explained that he had been right above the magic circle when it went off. The White Dragon Emperor had divided its power, which had saved them from worse consequences. He then looked down at Zenobia with concern, patted her shoulder, and urged her to get up, warning that giving up would only make everyone she cared about sad. At that moment, Issei's phone began to ring, and he pulled it out to answer. Edward introduced himself over the phone and asked what Middle needed. He listened in silence, nodding occasionally, then closed the call and announced that he would be home immediately. He told everyone that his 4th guest had finally awakened from a coma and excused himself before vanishing in a flash of green light. The others exchanged looks, slightly annoyed. Rias offered a small smile and congratulated everyone on being safe. She then addressed Issei, Saji, and Kiba about betraying the group. Rias and Sona administered disciplinary measures to the 3, leaving Issei and Saji shaken and Kiba standing in embarrassed silence. Edward arrived at the med bay on the 4th floor to find the 2 fallen angels waiting outside the room with downcast expressions. Calla Warner if something was wrong. Calla Warner, tearful, indicated that the person in the bed was not the Rainier they knew. Donasek motioned toward the door as if urging Edward to look for himself. Inside, Edward found Middle crying while a different-looking girl gently cradled her head. The visitor resembled Rainier but looked younger. Edward introduced himself and asked to speak with the visitor. Middle left the room with tears in her eyes. The young woman introduced herself as Yuma Amano and thanked Edward for caring for her while she was injured. Edward deflected the thanks to the friends who had brought her to his home. Yuma admitted she remembered only her name and no other personal memories. She glanced sadly at her missing right arm and leg and described how the absence felt oddly natural to her. Edward asked Yuma to close her eyes and give him her left hand so he could check for memory issues after her extended sleep. He searched her mind briefly and then stepped outside to speak with Chulainn, Donasek, Middlet, and the former members of Riser's peerage who had gathered. Edward asked whether they wanted the good news or the bad first. He explained that the good news was that Yuma still had access to her wings and light powers. Then he delivered the bad news. Heir was gone and would not return. Middlet protested, insisting she had seen Heir in the room. Edward gently explained that his examination of the woman's mind suggested Heir's existence had been erased. He suggested they begin building a relationship with Yuma Amano instead and invited them to see her again. Chulainn, Donasek, and Middlet returned to the room to be with Yuma, and Edward led the former members of Phoenix into the main room. He asked them to sit, then activated an orange magic circle that summoned Riser. Riser's former peerage knelt and greeted him, to which Riser looked surprised and directed a glare at Edward. Edward proposed offering them the choice to return to Riser's service. One by one, Cirrus, Chulainn, and I, Lee, Nell, and Al stepped forward and pledged themselves once more. Maihi, however, chose to remain with Edward as a bishop. Riser questioned Maihi's decision and asked why she preferred to stay. Maihi stammered that the place was vast and would be ashamed to leave, her words breaking off as she blurted that he had fallen in love with Sebastian. The blunt accusation came from the second-year student Maihi. Her face lit up and she flushed with embarrassment. Maihi then requested that Lord Riser return the evil pieces she had given him. The Phoenix scion Riser, reluctant, produced the knight, the rook, and the pawns he had been given as servants and handed them back to the human before him. Maihi asked Edward Chulainn why he was doing this for Riser and reminded him of what Riser had done to his friends. Edward acknowledged that he remembered and explained that he had taught Riser a lesson to curb his ego and anger, warning that if a different person had been involved, they might never return the servants and could commit unspeakable acts. Riser listened, then nodded and chuckled. He admitted he had underestimated Edward Chulainn, announced that he would be taking his leave, and asked that Edward take care of Maihi. With that, Riser and his recovered servants departed. Maihi praised Lord Edward for thinking the plan through and for even helping Riser with his ego. Edward told Maihi that if she were to stay as one of his servants, she would have to help with chores and address him by his name or as Master Edward. Maihi agreed, and the Ravenet shooed her off to bed while Edward stepped outside to take a moment alone. Outside, Edward breathed in the cool night air and looked at the evil pieces. He waved his hand and caused them to turn into cherry pits. A dark silver case appeared. When he opened it, he found 4 void black pawns and a bishop inside, with empty slots where other pieces should be. He tossed the bishop into the air and watched it transform into another cherry pit, noting that Riser would not be able to revive anyone with a cherry pit. Edward thought that only 4 pieces remained before he could call the others, and wondered whether Chulainn and the others would accept his proposal. He made the cherry pits and the suitcase vanish and began to stand, patting dust from his pants, when he heard running footsteps approaching. A white-haired girl with a blue right-handed gauntlet set with a blood-red jewel sprinted up and launched a sudden, forceful strike that sent Edward stumbling backward in an exaggerated, anime-style impact. He fell back and wondered who she was and why she had hit him. Joyeuse was the holy sword of the French knight Charlemagne, who had served alongside Roland, the first wielder of Durandal. The sword was meant for those who wished to keep others safe and to lead them toward a peaceful tomorrow. Joyeuse had a simple blue grip and a gold guard etched with blue markings. The flat of the silver blade bore gold along the bottom edge with touches of blue that formed the suggestion of a cross on a field of blue. Its powers resembled those of legendary holy weapons. It enhanced the abilities of its wielder's allies, could dampen the powers of enemies, and could produce a bright light capable of blinding foes while leaving comrades unimpeded. Everything at Kuoh Academy had been restored to normal, which still surprised Issei after all the damage from 2 nights before. He had expected parts of the school to be closed, but things were back in place. He groaned inwardly as he realized that Parents' Day was the next day and he was not prepared. The reminder had come after Lord Lucifer and Graphia had shown up following a meeting with one of his clients, who turned out to be Azazel, the Governor-General of the Fallen Angels. Surzex had also mentioned that Azazel was attending an upcoming peace conference between the three factions, which would be held at the school. Matsuda shouted loudly into Issei's right ear, making him jump. Motohama pushed up his glasses and explained that they had heard a rumor about 2 new transfer students arriving. He noted that Zenobia and Yumi had joined only recently and joked about their luck. Issei thought of Zenobia and Yumi and smiled softly. One of the former exorcists had become Rias Gremory's second knight, and others had found places among the different teams. After learning about the death of God, several had left the church to join Rias and Sona. Issei answered that someone must indeed be smiling on them. Motohama described one of the incoming students as having white hair with black tips and electric blue eyes. Matsuda added that the other appeared to have black hair and violet eyes. When Issei heard the description of black hair and violet eyes, he froze. Only one person he knew had those traits, and he had seen her fall when Rias had unleashed her power. He told himself to stop worrying and sprinted toward his first class to avoid being late. In the classroom, the teacher announced that a new transfer student would be joining them and invited everyone to welcome her. The new student entered with white hair tipped in black and wore it in a ponytail. Up close, Issei noted that she was about the same height as Akino and that her electric blue eyes were ringed with a faint red around the iris, an exotic touch. She introduced herself as Rose Geel with a slight Scottish accent and asked everyone to take care of her. Motohama and Matsuda, unusually subdued, did not make their typical crude remarks, and Issei briefly worried about their distraction. Kiba then arrived and informed them that Asia, Zenobia, and Issei were to report to the Occult Research Club during the lunch break. They nodded and returned to class. At the Occult Research Club, Rias sat with a harsh glare focused on Chulainn and the new black-haired student. Issei, Asia, and Zenobia followed Rias's summons to come forward while Rias spoke to the Irish man with a tone that carried hostility. The black-haired student looked down in shame. As Issei and the others moved around the couch toward their master, Issei caught a clear look at the black-haired girl's face and froze in anguish. Asia reacted the same way. The face before them belonged to the one who had defeated them before, Heir. Issei had believed she had died when Rias's power had struck her down. Driven by anger, Issei began to activate the boosted gear and prepare to strike, but he stopped when a cold blade pressed against his throat. He looked where the blade had come from and was surprised to see Edward holding it. Issei demanded to know what Edward was doing and why he was protecting her, the last accusation making Heir lower her head in shame. Edward asked Issei to deactivate his sacred gear and explained that he had been about to clarify why Yuma was there before Issei had tried to strike her. He returned Fragarak to his lap, keeping it ready to deter anyone who might threaten the girl at his side. Edward then recounted that he had been present when she woke from her coma after they had beaten Kokabeel. Rias nodded and continued to study the fallen figure with mild curiosity. Edward described receiving a call from Middlet about Heir's awakening and rushing to speak with her, only to find someone who did not match the woman Donasik had once carried into Rias's home. After probing her mind, he discovered that Heir was gone and that the person standing before them was Yuma Amano. Edward tapped Yuma's shoulder to indicate that she should speak for herself. Yuma rose unsteadily and introduced herself as Yuma Amano, apologizing for anything Heir had done and expressing that she did not want there to be any hardship between the group and her brother. Rias raised an eyebrow and asked Edward what Yuma meant by mentioning a brother. Edward flinched briefly, then told them he had called his parents the day after the fight to ask if they would adopt Yuma into the family. They had agreed and allowed her to keep her surname. He warned that anyone who thought of harming his little sister would face his wrath. Rias acknowledged his words and offered a gentle smile to Yuma. Rias apologized to Yuma for the trouble Heir had caused and, understanding Yuma was not the same person, extended a hand in friendship. Yuma stammered that she wanted to make amends for Heir's actions and intended to start by apologizing to Rias's pawn and bishop. Rias nodded and smiled. Yuma, still visibly shaking, then moved toward the two devils behind Rias and noticed Issei staring at her with wide eyes. Yuma confessed that she knew people might never forgive what her former self had done, but she hoped they could be friends. Asia placed a reassuring hand on Yuma's shoulder and told her that she did not need to seek forgiveness for things she had not done and that she was her own person. Asia asked Issei to back her up. Issei snapped out of his trance and agreed that Asia was right. Yuma began to tremble and then sobbed, tears of both sorrow and relief, thanking them for their willingness to forgive her, especially Issei. Issei felt overwhelmed, his memories of past events coming back to him each time he looked at her face, and he struggled with the complex emotions that brought. Asia hugged Yuma, sharing in the emotional release, while Edward tapped Issei on the shoulder and urged him not to let what Heir had done destroy the chance for a new friendship with Yuma. Issei gave a small, reluctant nod, and Edward returned the gesture. The bells signaling the start of class rang at that moment. Yuma realized that the prosthetic arm Azazel had made for her had come off and was now in Rias's possession. With the arm back where it belonged, the group exchanged brief waves before Kiba, a flushed Yuma, and Edward headed to their class while Asia, Issei, and Zenobia went to the next day. Issei muttered that he hated it there as his classmates tried to persuade him to part with a sculpture he had recently made. Matsuda offered to trade, Motohama suggested paying part of his allowance for a week, Keitase made a longer offer, and Murayama tried to mediate the bargaining. The attention stemmed from a figure Issei had unconsciously created that resembled a classmate, which had drawn unwanted interest. Issei told them firmly that he was not giving it to any of them because he intended to give it to the president, and the others reluctantly backed off. Rose sat at her desk with a realistic dragon model she had been finishing, mentally teasing the dragon within her about its own pride and lamenting the situation with Draig and his host. The inner voice replied with amusement, but Rose's thought shifted to the potential Edward had mentioned earlier. If Edward's assessment was correct, Issei might become one of the strongest red dragon emperors in history. The dragon within her snorted, and then fell silent. As Rose added the final touches to her dragon, the bell rang and the students filed out. She noticed that Issei and the sculpture were already gone. With a small sigh, Rose dismissed her model into a small magic circle, where it vanished. She exited the room and saw boys rushing toward the gym, saying there was a magical girl photo shoot inside. With a small sigh and a crack of her knuckles, she headed for the gym only to find the crowd had just left. Looking in before entering, she saw Issei, Asia, Rias, and Aquino standing in front of the stage where a young woman wore a magical girl Milky Spiral 7 alternative cosplay. Saji stood beside the cosplayer, regarding her curiously. Saji asked if she had come to visit someone. The girl nodded with a jubilant smile. Saji then asked if her companions had told her that the outfit might not be appropriate for the occasion. The girl considered that for a moment, then gave a playful smirk and chanted her magical phrase. Saji complained that she needed to stop that. Issei approached and teased that she was hard at work as usual. Asia looked annoyed at the interruption and told the cosplayer that she did not have time for this right now and that she should leave. At that moment the gym doors burst open and Sona entered, demanding to know what was going on. Saji began to explain, but the cosplayer looked past him and towards Sona and announced that she had finally found her. The cosplayer then insisted on a dramatic, affectionate reunion and suggested an embrace, but Sona did not react. Those who did not yet know that the cosplayer and Sona were sisters looked on in surprise as Lady Leviathan behaved with exuberant familiarity. Rias noted that she had not known Seraphal was Sona's older sister. Rias then remarked that, similarly, others did not know the current Lucifer was her brother. Seraphal asked how long it had been and how much everyone had missed her. Rias replied that it had been some time. Seraphal cheerfully asked how excited Rias was to see her. Rias thanked her and asked whether she had come to visit Sona for open house. Seraphal nodded and then spotted someone trying to sneak past the open doors behind her sister. She called for Edward to come back and offered him a place in her peerage, which sent the boy, his sister, and two older people, likely his parents, hastily away to preserve a low profile. Sona collapsed to her knees in exhaustion. Rias and Saji helped her to her feet. Saji joked that Sona now owed Edward a favor for rescuing her sister's attention for the moment. Sona agreed as she and Saji returned to work in the student council room. Aquino chuckled and teased Rias about her brother and father, wondering aloud where they might be. Rias tensed briefly and then answered that, with the day nearly over, they were probably at the gate waiting with Issei's parents for Issei, Asia, and herself. The group made their way to the school gate and found Issei's parents there with Rias's brother and father. Nearby, 2 students were breathing rather heavily. Those students were Edward and Yuma, who were with their parents. Edward's father presented a lean, athletic appearance, younger than expected, with blue hair and crimson eyes that matched Edward's. His stepmother was striking and seemed similarly youthful, with black hair and warm brown eyes. Edward blushed visibly as Yuma patted him on the back, embarrassed by the attention from his parents. Cedric, Edward's father, said that he and Francine planned to head over to Edward's residence to learn more about their new daughter. Issei's mother gave them permission to visit, and Edward's family began to walk toward his apartment. After leaving the others' sight, they teleported away. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at the house where Edward had been living since coming to Japan. Cedric cheerfully asked how his son had been, and Edward reacted with an embarrassed flinch before entering. Yuma and his parents followed. Inside, the servants stood and bowed. Sebastian Michaelis introduced himself as at their service for the time being. Shinra Long offered his greetings as well. Lulu Armistice reported for duty. Ox Ford, Maka Albern, and Tsubaki Nakatsukasa each announced themselves and bowed together, promising to help with whatever might be needed. Francine responded with a kind smile as she looked over at Tsubaki. Francine asked Tsubaki to take her and Cedric's suitcases to a spare bedroom. Tsubaki immediately obliged, took both suitcases, and began the trek to a spare room in the house. Francine's husband raised an eyebrow and asked Edward about the Scot, since Edward had already told them about the fallen angels living there. Edward explained that Rose was not present at the moment but was expected back soon. She was staying until she could find a place of her own because the house felt too empty for her tastes. Edward sat on a couch in one of the side rooms and then turned the conversation to Yuma, asking if there was something Francine wanted to tell her. At the mention of the sister, the fallen angel looked up at her new parents with curiosity. Francine sighed and asked Edward whether he had told Yuma about the sister who had been supposed to come. Francine explained that the sister had resembled Yuma at the same age but had been killed by her uncle. Yuma gasped and looked to Edward with concern. Cedric added that how the uncle had escaped unscathed was a mystery, and that Scathach had come down hard on the matter in retaliation. Francine, recalling the past, said that when the uncle had turned on her, a crimson spear had suddenly struck him and ended him, and Edward had used that moment to stop him. Edward had saved Francine but could not save his sister. Francine then revealed that something had gone wrong during Faith's DLVRY and she could no longer become P-Arginin T, and when the sister died they had lost hope. Now, with Yuma there, they wanted to ask an important question. Francine asked Yuma whether she would accept being made their official daughter through a Celtic blood exchange ritual. If Yuma agreed, she would become their full-blooded daughter, retain her ability to craft light weapons and fly with her wings, and gain the right to wield the legendary sword of their ancestor, Calidbalg. Yuma was stunned by the offer. She realized this would make the people before her truly her family, and she did not want to pass it up. She agreed to try to be the best daughter she could be for them. Francine, Cedric, and Edward drew Yuma into a warm embrace. Francine and Cedric cried tears of joy while Edward held her protectively, desperate for her safety. Middlet, watching the exchange from the second floor with Maihi, called down a playful comment about how sweet the moment was, only to be lightly scolded and nudged by the bishop before they both walked away. Cedric shook his head at their antics and then he and his wife began preparations for the blood exchange ritual. Yuma wiped her tears and moved to stand, but Edward gently drew her back into his arms. Edward thanked Yuma and told her she was his little sister, his voice breaking as he promised she would be protected. He vowed that even though she counted among his pawns, he would never allow harm to come to her. If necessary, he or the others Calawarner and Donasek would train her to defend herself. Yuma resolved that she wanted everyone to train her, determined to be able to fend for herself if they were not present. Edward smiled for the first time since the loss of his friends 3 years ago. Cedric announced that the ritual was ready. Yuma approached a glowing circle set into the floor that contained the ceremonial mixture and took a deep breath. She removed her artificial appendages and allowed Edward to help her lie down within the circle. She closed her eyes as the ritual began and the chamber filled with a steady, ritualistic glow. Next day at the Occult Research Club, Rhea stood before a set of sealed doors wrapped in keep-out tape and told her peerage that inside lay her other bishop. Asia, looking at the doors with astonishment, asked why someone would be kept in a place like that. Rhea explained that the bishop's power had been too much for her to control at the time, so the seals had been placed to contain it, but that they had been given permission to remove the seals after proving themselves during the Kokabeel incident. Issei, nervous, remarked that it sounded terrifying. Aquino clarified that the bishop inside had actually become something of a shut-in, refusing to be unsealed at night despite being allowed to roam the old school building. Rhys added that the bishop had become their biggest earner by making contracts through a special laptop designed for that purpose, since some clients preferred not to meet a devil face-to-face. Rhys remarked that the young person had become quite accomplished by making deals of that sort. Aquino announced that she was opening the door, and when the high-class devil pulled it back, a high-pitched sound came from inside. Aquino noted that the visitors seemed full of energy. Gasper cried out in alarm and asked why they were there. Aquino explained that the seal had been undone and that he could come out now, inviting him to join them. Gasper insisted that he wanted to stay and that he did not like people. Issei observed that this might be a case of agoraphobia when he finally saw the second bishop. Issei reacted with surprise at the appearance and made a flustered comment born of confusion. Rhys corrected him by indicating that, biologically, the student was male. Issei and Gasper both reacted loudly in response. Gasper apologized and flinched. Issei muttered his bewilderment about the situation. Gasper answered shyly and then asked who Issei was. Rhys introduced the new arrivals as her pawn, Issei Heir, her bishop, Asia Argento, and her knight, Zenobia Corda. Gasper squealed at the number of new people and tried to crawl away, only to be grasped briefly on the arm by Issei. Issei suggested they go outside to meet the others and get to know each other better, but Gasper slipped free and scuttled to the other side of the room. Issei stared at his hand in confusion, then at Gasper. Kiba suggested leaving Gasper in his room for the moment so they could talk in the main room, catching Issei's attention, and everyone moved to the main area. In the main room, Rhys explained that what they had just seen was why Gasper had been confined. She described his sacred gear, forbidden Baylor view, which allowed him to momentarily stop time within his field of vision. She identified him as Gasper Vladi, her bishop, a first-year student at Kuoh Academy, and a half-vampire, half-human hybrid. Issei asked whether stopping time wasn't too valuable a power to lose. Rhys shook her head and clarified that the real problem was Gasper's inability to control his own sacred gear. His tendency to use it accidentally had been the reason he had been sealed. Issei acknowledged the strength of having such a servant and a bishop piece, but Rhys looked down at the chessboard on her desk and corrected him, saying that Gasper's piece was a mutation. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look toward Gasper's door. Gasper cried that he wanted to be left alone as he ran from Zenobia, who waved Durandal at him. The chase had been going on for 10 to 15 minutes while Issei, Asia, and Kaneko watched. They had coaxed the cross-dressing recluse outside by lifting the box he had been hiding in and dumping him onto the ground, which had started Zenovia's pursuit. Issei watched with a slight cringe as Gasper barely ran and Zenobia gently sprinted behind him. Asia looked at Issei with concern and asked if they should give Gasper a break. Issei privately thought Asia was too kind and agreed, telling Zenobia to stop chasing Gasper for now and let him catch his breath. Zenobia complied and put Durandal away, announcing that they would continue working on Gasper's sacred gear control later. Gasper collapsed onto the ground, panting, and pleaded to be allowed back inside. Zenobia settled under a tree while Gasper lay face down. Saji approached with a trowel and explained that he had come by because Rhys had finally let her other bishop out of the room. He added that the blonde was very cute. Issei informed him that the person was a man who liked to crossdress. Saji's expression fell into dismay as he muttered that the universe had played a cruel joke. Issei asked about the gardening tool, and Saji answered that he was checking the flower beds as part of student council duty. The two pawns laughed at the idea of it being grunt work. A new voice came from the old school building entrance, and everyone turned. A man with black hair and blonde bangs, wearing a gray yukata, stood there. He greeted the Red Dragon Emperor and said he had not seen him since that night. Issei reacted at the sight of Azazel. In response, Issei's boosted gear activated, Zenobia redrew Durandal, Kaneko took a fighting stance, and Saji summoned the absorption line onto his arm. Azazel waved dismissively and said there was no need to be on guard, that he did not enjoy toying with low-level devils. He asked where their friend with the holy devil sword was, saying he had wanted a look at him. The brunette warned that Kiba was not there and that they would not allow anyone to go after him, raising his sacred gear in defense. Azazel scoffed that the group had not even been able to defeat Kokabeel and suggested they would not stand a chance against him. He then turned his attention to the trembling Gasper who had sought cover nearby. He identified Gasper as the vampire who wielded Forbidden Baler View, explaining that it was a sacred gear tied to the senses and could be dangerous if its user's body was not strong enough. It suggested that augmenting devices could temporarily compensate for such weaknesses, but that Devilside research on sacred gears had not progressed far in that area. Azazel advised Saji to use his absorption line to siphon off the excess power and help stabilize Gasper during training by connecting the line to him. Saji widened his eyes and looked down at the small lizard-like symbol on his arm that represented his sacred gear, asking if it could siphon power from other sacred gears. At that moment Edward appeared carrying a box of octopus ball and greeted Azazel. Azazel playfully slapped Edward on the back, causing a piece of octopus ball to fly out of the box and land in Edward's fingers. Edward narrowed his eyes and warned Azazel that he had nearly crossed into dangerous territory, making his displeasure clear with a stern glare. Azazel backed up a step and laughed lightly, insisting that he had meant no harm and had not expected the snack to fall out. He then expanded on his earlier point, explaining that within Saji's absorption line lay the power of the prison dragon Vritra, one of the 5 great dragon kings, which could drain the power of anything it was attached to. He said that the line could be removed from oneself and connected to an ally to temporarily boost that ally's power, and that with training Saji could create multiple lines to greatly increase the amount he could absorb. Issei began to ask why, but Edward bonked him on the head and told him not to question help. Edward reminded Issei that even if Kokabeel wanted war, Lord Azazel was against it and would attend the peace conference with Issei's rival. Issei reacted with surprise and looked to Azazel for confirmation. Azazel only nodded. Edward then apologized for Vala's earlier behavior and explained that Vala had been eager to see his rival again and that he hoped Vala had not caused any trouble, adding that Vala was an odd character who did not want anyone to misunderstand his intentions. A Grigori official, the Celt, told Lord Azazel that his hobby had kept him in the area long enough and urged him to return to his office and organize it before any more meddling. The Celt made a shooing gesture, prompting Azazel to laugh heartily and then disappear. Issei asked Edward how he could speak so casually to the fallen angel's leader. Edward explained, in a deadpan tone, that he was on good terms with several high-ranking Grigori officials, including Lord Azazel, and that 4 fallen angels lived in his home, one of whom had artificial limbs made by Azazel. Those who knew the last detail reacted with nervous surprise. Edward then approached Gasper and held out a small box. The elated bishop immediately climbed into it. Edward told Saji that he would be borrowing his sacred gear for a while so Saji could return to his duties. Saji began to protest, but a stinger-like projectile from Gear Snatcher struck his chest and the device began to glow dark purple, leaving Saji startled. Edward explained that he intended to borrow Absorption Line briefly to help Gasper with his training, but the stinger returned to the main gauntlet and Edward sighed, acknowledging that Saji already had a strong connection to his sacred gear. Undeterred, Edward picked up the box with one hand, set it on his head, grabbed Saji by the arm, and dragged him toward the Occult Research Club room. He promised to explain to Sona why Saji would be late and then greeted Rias as he passed. Rias watched Edward's departing form and then turned to her peerage to ask what had happened. The others began to recap the events. That night, Issei leaned against the door of Gasper's room with a slightly defeated expression and called out to Gasper. Gasper replied with a nervous affirmation. Issei reminded Gasper that, although Edward had helped him control his powers for the moment, he needed to leave the room so they could determine whether he could maintain that control consistently. Gasper asked why he should leave. He preferred staying inside where he believed he would not cause trouble. Issei explained that Gasper staying in the sealed room made the president feel as if she were failing him. Gasper protested that he could not handle the stares when he left the room and that he feared Rias would not allow him to bring his box to class. He asked what else he could do. Issei thought for a moment and then brightened, announcing that he had an idea and would reveal it to the others the next day, asking Gasper to wait. Issei left the clubroom and, as he moved through the woods, heard the clash of metal and wood. Curiosity drove him to the source. Hidden behind a shrubbery, he watched Edward training a group of students and instructing them to finish for the night and head home. Murayama thanked Edward for his help. She wore a silver pauldron set with 6 half-shaded jewels. Beside her, Keitase had on azure gauntlets with green jewels. Matsuda and Motohama joked about their progress, and Aika, who was present with a pair of armored green wings 1 shade darker than the other, with thin metal strips like feathers, stood nearby. Yuma and Rose were off to the side picking up practice swords. Yuma carried a straight katana in a white sheath, and Rose had a dark blue gauntlet with a red jewel. Seeing the girls with sacred gears and realizing his friends were being trained, Issei understood that they knew about the supernatural world. He hurried away to inform the president. The next day in the Occult Research Club room, Rias listened intently as Issei reported what he had seen. Rias asked for clarification that 6 other people knew about the supernatural and that several of them had sacred gears. Issei confirmed and listed the students he had seen Edward training: Matsuda, Keitase, Motohama, Murayama, Aika, Yuma, and Rose. Issei thought it looked more like Rose was helping with their training as well. He looked down at the ground, then glanced over at Gasper, who had a paper bag with 2 eye holes covering his head. Aquino warned him to be cautious when he was around them, since they were more than likely aware that they were all devils. The bell for class rang and the others left. As Issei turned to go, Aquino gave him a sweet smile and asked him to meet her at the shrine outside of town after school. Issei nodded and watched her leave for class, musing about why she wanted him to come. After school, he arrived at the shrine and froze when he saw Edward standing there. Issei demanded to know why Edward was here and whether Aquino had invited him as well. Edward explained that Aquino had not invited him and that he had been asked by someone else. He also questioned how Issei intended to enter a shrine, reminding him that Miss Gremory had warned him to stay away from shrines and churches. Those words clicked into Issei's mind and he realized with horror that he was on enemy territory. The idea of talking to Aquino there felt daunting. Aquino appeared and said she had been asked to bring Issei here by someone else. When they turned, a young man in armor similar to the one Surzexes had worn when they first met stood before them. The man introduced himself as Michael and identified himself as the current leader of Heaven. Issei's jaw dropped at the presence of the man who had led Heaven since God's death. Edward explained that he had been summoned by someone else and asked whether Lady Gabriel was in one of the side rooms. Michael pointed to a door. Edward bowed respectfully and entered. Inside, a composed woman sat in a formal posture on the tatami mats. She greeted Edward warmly and invited him to sit and have tea while they talked. Edward sat and poured tea for both of them. He guessed that the meeting might be related to the challenge between the factions, but Lady Gabriel clarified that she wanted him to attend a peace conference with his friends and help defend the leaders. She explained that she would not attend herself but that her brother would, and as payment for his assistance, she produced a silver short sword with a bright flash of light. The sword was the holy sword Arondite, once wielded by Sir Lancelot and known for minor dragon-slaying qualities. Gabriel said the sword had been reacting to Edward specifically and that she could no longer maintain its holy form indefinitely, so she wished for him to have it. Edward examined the sword, noting a red jewel embedded in the guard, and took hold of its hilt. A sheath appeared and he secured it at his side. Gabriel asked Edward to protect her brother and the other leaders so the peace conference could succeed, then disappeared in a flash of light that left a golden cross lingering briefly before dissipating. Edward returned to the main room where the light from Michael's departure had just faded. He noticed that Issei's summoned sacred gear had become fused with a holy dragon-slaying sword and took a step back in surprise. Edward observed that Michael had given Issei a sword and asked Issei why Michael had done so. Issei and Aquino turned to see Edward standing there with a sword at his side. Issei explained that Michael had given him the sword in exchange for his help in bringing unity to the three factions. Issei asked Edward about Lady Gabriel's demeanor and appearance, curious about what she had been like. Aquino lightly reprimanded him for his lack of manners and told him to be polite. Edward then confirmed that Gabriel had given him a rondite and had asked him to help protect her brother and the other leaders at the conference. Edward looked down at the sheathed rondite and warned that something would go wrong at that meeting with Miss Hymenima. Aquino chuckled softly, agreed that he might be right, and thanked them for visiting her humble abode as she saw the two second-year students to the door. In an unknown location, a flip phone began to ring. A hand grabbed it on the second ring and opened it. Issei answered, gave his alias, and then brightened when he heard it was his boss calling. He smiled with mischief, promised to inform the others, and said they would catch the next flight to Japan as soon as they could. Issei ran into a room where 7 people sat. He announced the call, and the group reacted with excitement and speculation. Toka, a dark plum-haired girl in a long ponytail, leapt with delight at the news. Shizu, a tall blonde man in a bartender outfit, suspected Issei of teasing, but Issei corrected him and confirmed the news. The brown-haired girl Saryu, hair tied in a short ponytail, cried out in excitement at the prospect of seeing Edward again. The pink-haired girl with twin tails and magenta ribbons, who led the group, asked the Alpha to check their savings so she could secure cheap plane seats to Japan. The others looked to her as their temporary leader. She agreed that they should reunite with their master and began packing. When she was alone, she gazed out the window and sighed, promising that they would be by their master's side again soon, then rose to continue packing for their journey. On conference day, Issei and Edward found Gasper in his room playing one of the many games Issei had brought to keep him entertained. Issei asked if Gasper wanted to join them for the meeting, but Gasper shook his head and indicated he did not want to be in a room with very powerful people because it would be too scary. Kaneko patted the dampers back and urged the others to hurry to the meeting room. As Issei and Edward left the old school building for the current school, a familiar feminine voice called for them to wait. Rose arrived and Issei wondered aloud whether she was human. Rose confirmed that she was human as she joined the group. The 4 students from Kuoh Issei, Edward, Kaneko, and Rose walked to the meeting room together. Inside the meeting room, they saw Rias and the others standing behind Surzex and Graphia. Issei noticed Lady Leviathan with Sona behind her. Before Lord Lucifer sat Lord Michael with an angel beside him and Irina present as well. Azazel wore a black shirt and a trench coat, and the white dragon Emperor Valus stood behind him. Michael declared that the peace conference could begin. Surzex, the Governor-General, then asked Azazel to explain the actions of General Kokabeel, speaking with a stern glare. Azazel corrected that Kokabeel was an ex-general and insisted that Kokabeel's actions had been his own, not orders from Azazel. Azazel indicated that the White Dragon Emperor had taken care of the situation personally. He said they had labeled Kokabeel a criminal and locked him in the depths of the frozen prison of Cocytus, and that Kokabeel would not be returning. Surzex pushed further, asking why the Grigori had been gathering so many sacred gear wielders in recent decades, noting that the numbers suggested preparation for war rather than a desire for peace. Azazel sighed and replied that war did not interest him and that the Grigori's efforts were for research purposes only. He offered to share his findings, emphasized that he was content with the world as it was, and said he had instructed his subordinates not to interfere in human politics, religious affairs, or devil matters. Azazel proposed that they skip the formalities and make peace, reminding everyone that this was the purpose of their gathering. Michael agreed that peace was desirable but warned that they could not ignore the losses suffered in the Great War. He stood and reflected that even if God was gone, the world continued to move forward, and that what remained were the systems that had been left behind. With that issue resolved, they prepared to hear from the Red Dragon Emperor to whom a moment had been offered. At the end of the meeting, Surzex asked if they were all in agreement, and Seraphol, Michael, Azazel, and the 2 Dragon Emperors nodded in response. Surzex was about to declare their official status when a small wave of power froze Asia, Aquino, Kaneko and Sona in place. Issei cried out that time had stopped and concluded that Gasper must be involved. Rias realized that her bishop, Gasper, was being used by someone who had frozen everyone. Valley warned that they should look outside because it was not only those inside who were affected, and that they had been betrayed. When they looked outside, they saw the gathered forces frozen as well, and giant magic circles spitting out spellcasters. Issei stared in awe and then noticed two people were missing from the room. He asked where Rose and Edward had gone, and it was clear they were gone from the meeting as if they had never been there. On the roof of the school, Rose and Edward found themselves surrounded by a light purple mist and drew their swords. Edward identified his sacred gear, Dimension Lost, as one of the 13 Longinus-class sacred gears capable of creating pocket dimensions, and he asked Cao Cao to correct him if he was mistaken. Two figures approached. One with black hair and one with silver hair. The black-haired man confirmed Edward's assessment, addressed Chulainn, and remarked that there was indeed a descendant of Siegfried present, warning Siegfried to be careful not to lose any of his swords. The silver-haired man, Siegfried, nodded to Cao Cao, who rested the true Longinus on his shoulder as he stood before them. Rose made it clear that she would not join Cao Cao's faction or aid the terrorists outside. Her sacred gear manifested the sword Bloodfang, which she pointed at Siegfried. Edward drew Gibog and aimed it at Cao Cao, the descendant of the original Cao Cao. Cao Cao indicated that if they refused to join willingly, he would simply forcefully defeat them to make them comply. Siegfried responded by manifesting a silver arm and drawing 3 swords Gram, Bameng, and Not Hung and challenged Rose directly, warning her that his blades would not hold back even against a descendant of Siegfried. Rose snickered and reminded him that every rose has its thorns. The 4 combatants charged and clashed in a high-energy, anime-style duel. Swords flashed and sparks flew as Rose and Edward traded rapid, skillful strikes against Siegfried and Cao Cao. The exchange was intense and dramatic but non-graphic, a swift contest of technique and will rather than anything gruesome. In the misty terrain of Dimension Lost, sparks popped up in random locations as Cao Cao and Edward reappeared with their spears locked against each other. Cao Cao smirked while Edward pushed the descendant away and told him to give up. He believed Cao Cao could not defeat him. The raven-haired man chuckled and pointed the weapon True Longinus at Edward, claiming he was not alone in the fight. The Celt barely leapt aside to avoid a burst of fire that singed the ground. Cao Cao grunted at his miss and promised he would not miss next time. A blond man in a red coat with golden vambraces over a military-style school uniform then arrived. Cao Cao asked after Heracles, Gilgamesh, and Jean. The blonde, Nero, nodded toward the skirmish where Siegfried and Rose were contesting each other and then saw a pale-haired girl enter the fray and clash with Rose. Cao Cao prepared to move on, but both he and Nero jumped back as Edward lunged, the spear Gibog sweeping dangerously close. Edward warned that talking on the battlefield was a good way to get killed. Nero glared and formed ball of fire in his hands, threatening to incinerate Edward, before throwing them. Edward swatted the flames aside with Gibog and turned to face Nero when a sudden impact struck his side with an explosive force and sent him flying. A tall, burly figure shouldered through, announcing that he had finally arrived. He argued with the extremely young blonde girl perched on his shoulder, insisting she should have followed Cao Cao's orders. The girl protested loudly that she did not want to fight and just wanted her parents. Nero berated the child, but when he raised his hand to strike her, something strange and immediate happened. He recoiled in shock and pain where his hand had been. His hand was suddenly gone, and he screamed in disbelief while accusing Edward of taking it. Edward, holding the sword of light in his right hand and cradling the child under his left arm, set the girl down gently and offered a reassuring smile. He told her everything would be all right and asked her to stay put while he handled the situation. The little girl nodded, and Edward turned to the 3 men with disgust, condemning them for bringing a child onto a battlefield and asking how low they were willing to go. Cao Cao pretended ignorance and insisted they were only there to prove that humans were superior to angels, devils, and even the gods. Edward replied that humans already had the advantage, Many supernatural beings relied on humans for strength, contracts, or recognition to exist. As he finished, a battered rose was flung toward them. She landed, rolled, and stood at Edward's back with the small girl between them. Rose greeted Edward, initially flustered until she realized there was a child with him. The girl introduced herself as Gilgamesh, shortening her name to Gil. Hearing Edward's earlier comment that humans were already better than the supernatural, Gil asked if she could return to the children's home and wait for her parents. Rose and Edward fell silent, considering the innocence of that wish. Rose confessed she was growing tired of the antagonists and that the child's words made her want to act. Edward agreed, then addressed Gil by name. He gently told her that he did not think her mother and father would be returning for her and that he would not take her back to the orphanage. He promised to take care of her himself, even if he had to fight to do it. Gil saw Edward in a new light. The emotionless warrior she had first met gave way to someone who offered protection and warmth. The scene held for a moment as alliances and intentions became clearer on the battlefield. She hesitantly wrapped her arms around his waist as tears of happiness slid down her face. Her single thought was that he was her big brother. Nero laughed, mocking that no one would help a brat like her and insisting they would not allow anyone to take her. He summoned a massive fireball with several smaller flames forming around his body. Siu agreed with Nero and refused to let anyone take Gilgamesh. Edward muttered that he should have had George erase her memory, then narrowed his eyes and rushed at Chow Chow with his spear. Their spears collided and Edward made it clear he would not stand down. Rias and Issei appeared in the main room of the old school building after using castling to get there. The pawn, noticing the unusual quiet, followed Rias as she led them toward Gasper's room. Light shone from beneath the closed door, and Issei clenched his left hand in frustration. Rias kicked the door open while Issei had the boosted gear engaged, and announced that they had come to rescue Gasper. Inside, one of the magicians of the Cow's Brigade held a dagger to Gasper's throat and threatened to kill him if anyone advanced. Gasper, the half-vampire, was trembling and begging to be killed, explaining that he did not want to hurt anyone anymore. The magician sneered that someone like Gasper should have been turned into a weapon and insulted Rias's worthiness. Issei interrupted sharply, telling Gasper to stop saying things that would make their president sad, and Gasper clung to the desire not to upset Rias. Issei activated Ascalon and, with a controlled motion, cut his right hand so a little of his blood fell free. He flung that blood toward Gasper, some of it landing near the corner of the damper's mouth. Gasper consumed what was offered, and his body transformed into a fluttering swarm of bats. The bats surged into the magicians, overwhelming them and disrupting their spells in a flurry of motion. One of the attackers realized in panic that the swarm was absorbing their magical energy. The bats then condensed into a single form with glowing eyes, causing the magicians to freeze in place. Issei dashed through the room and struck each frozen enemy, then used his signature move dress break to disrupt their magical defenses and render them unable to continue fighting. The action neutralized the immediate threat. Rias and the others helped restore Gasper to human form. Issei, grinning, was about to tease Gasper when Rias, wearing the king role with a slightly annoyed expression, grabbed him by the collar and reminded him that they needed to return to the fight and help their allies. Before they left, Issei put a silver armlet with a small green jewel on Gasper's arm to help regulate his power and prevent another uncontrolled shift. The four girls Akino, Kaneko, Asia, and Sona began to move again, dazed but alive. Michael breathed a relieved sigh and explained the situation. They were under attack by a terrorist organization known as the Cow's Brigade. The Zizel was engaged with a member of the Old Satan faction, Cat Area Leviathan. The White Dragon Emperor and Zenobia and Yudo were also fighting outside, and Edward and Rose were missing, suspected to have been taken by the Cow's Brigade as well. Sona adjusted her glasses and volunteered that they would go help immediately, then turned to the window to assess the battle. Outside, Zenobia battled a magician wielding a crystal sword while Kiba used sword birth to pin several foes. One attacker moved to strike Zenobia from behind until Issei fired a dragon shot that took the assailant out, and Rias, Issei, and Gasper arrived to join Zenobia. Issei teased Zenobia about watching herself, and she acknowledged his assist with thanks. As Azazel and Kateria's confrontation drew attention, all remaining magicians began to be drawn back into the magic circles in the sky. Kateria taunted Azazel, claiming the power of Ophis made him too weak to win and urging him to give up. Azazel touched his goatee, smiled with a devilish smirk and refused. He then produced a small golden spear with a round purple jewel at the pommel, preparing to continue the battle. The man activated his balance breaker, and a set of golden scale mail formed over him as a large bident appeared in his right hand. He declared that years of research had culminated in this, the balance breaker of the very first artificial sacred gear, the Downfall Dragon Spear and Downfall Dragon and other armor. Drake sensed the presence of the Gigantes Dragon Fafnir within the gear and noted that the crow had forced it into a burst state, meaning the artificial sacred gear would likely break after the fight. Issei heard Drake and looked at Azazel in awe as Azazel moved with effortless speed to subdue the woman. Kateria's right arm transformed into writhing tentacles that lashed out and wrapped around Azazel's left arm as she vowed that if she died, she would take him with her. Without hesitation, Azazel made a decisive move, severing his bound arm cleanly to free himself and use the moment to strike. Kateria collapsed and then detonated in a blinding flash, leaving the battlefield cleared of her threat. When the golden scale mail dissolved, the small spear that had formed it shattered, leaving a single purple jewel behind. Azazel touched the jewel with a brief, reverent gesture before slipping it into his coat. As he turned to check on the others, a blast of blue light struck the area. The dust settled to reveal Valet standing above them in his balance breaker. Azazel teased Valet about nearly going too far, and everyone realized the danger of Valet's arrival. Issei registered with alarm that Valet was a member of the Cow's Brigade. The scene shifted and the dimension warped into a devastated schoolyard. Debris and dust lay everywhere. Edward and Rose were covered in dust with bruises and minor cuts, and Gilgamesh stood largely unscathed. Their opponents fared worse. Nero, Jean, and Heracles were unconscious and battered on the ground, while Chow Chow and Siegfried were similarly bruised and exhausted. Edward, breathing in shallow gasps, asked Rose if she could handle Siegfried. Rose nodded, raising Bloodfang and preparing her sacred gear. Edward, steadying himself, vowed to deal with Chow Chow and challenged him to end things then and there. Chow Chow agreed and told Siegfried to handle Rose. He activated a subspecies balance breaker, growing 3 extra arms from his sides and right shoulder and withdrawing 3 swords from his coat. He announced the form as Chaos Edge Azura Ravage and taunted Rose, hoping she could keep up with Dainsleif and Turfing. Rose scoffed at the challenge, then asked her small companion Cheshire to watch over Gilgamesh while she fought. Cheshire agreed, appearing as a fluffy cat with a wide, mischievous smile. Gilgamesh promptly scooped the cat up and began fussing over it, prompting a light exchange about a promised fish. Siegfried activated his balance breaker. His combat apparel shifted into a blue Cheongsam with draconic motifs, dragon horns on his head, and clawed fingertips, forming the starburnt nightingale. He taunted Rose with contempt for her origins and rushed forward, swinging Graham in a powerful opening attack. Rose blocked with Bloodfang, but Siegfried's multiple swords forced her to retreat narrowly and take a few superficial scratches. They clashed again. Rose slid under his initial swings aimed with Graham and Dainsleif and delivered a precise kick that struck a vulnerable point, causing Siegfried to drop Bombing. Rose seized the moment and reached for the demon sword, but the weapon initially rebelled, causing her to fall to her knees in pain. Siegfried laughed, mocking her attempt to wield Bombing and belittling her background. Rose, despite the pain, pushed through the rejection and refused to be cowed. She declared that she would prove herself regardless of his insults. Bombing responded to her defiance, accepting her as its wielder and easing the pain. Siegfried observed the sudden turn in the fight and noted that the battle had just become more interesting. Chow Chow taunted Rose as the two prepared to clash again. Suddenly Chow Chow's body bounced between them and skidded to a stop. Siegfried turned back toward where he had come from, but a foot struck his face and sent him to land beside his leader. Rose's eye twitched when she saw Edward standing there with his blank expression and Guy Balg in hand, Gil laughing on his shoulders while Cheese made sure the child stayed put. Rose asked Edward why the child was on his shoulders as she rubbed her temples in annoyance. Edward explained in a monotonous voice that Chow Chow had been about to strike the girl, so he had rushed over, picked her up, and used Gibalg to block the true Longinus. The child added that her older brother had intervened and kicked the attacker away, sending him flying to where Chow Chow and Siegfried now lay, and she laughed as she pointed. Rose groaned in mild frustration. They turned their attention back to the terrorists and watched Chow Chow struggle to rise. Chow Chow declared that he was in a predicament and ordered George to get them out of there and leave the girl, claiming she would be too much trouble to brainwash. With that, Chow Chow, Siegfried, Heracles, Jean, and Nero vanished into a purple fog, which quickly dispersed to reveal that the group was back in the real world. They saw Valle leaving with a monkey Yukai. Valle told Issei that their next fight would be even more brutal and encouraged both of them to get stronger. The two disappeared into a magic circle, and Issei collapsed into Rias's embrace. Rias asked Edward if he felt they had missed something important. Edward nodded and then felt something rest against his head. Looking up, he saw the child on his shoulders had fallen asleep. The night stress had finally caught up with her. Edward said they would have to wait until morning to figure out what had happened and suggested they head back to Rias's place. French countryside. Serio urged Koro, Shirzwa, and Toka to push harder to get the man out before the Vatican learned he had been reincarnated and disrupted their plans to return to the master. A giant white, silo-shaped dog was pushing a large, sobbing dragon along with a blonde man and a dark plum-haired girl. Shirzwa argued that coercion was the only way to get the dragon moving, so he and Toka paused while Koro shrank to a more reasonable size. The dragon cried out for Martha, its 6 legs stamping the ground in sorrow. A tall, burly, shirtless man wearing a mask warned the dragon to stop stomping and pointed to 2 sisters watching with hungry expressions. The dragon was the famed Tarask, the stone armor dragon, once renowned for ferocity and danger but now weeping over the woman it had chosen to protect. The dragon's grief stemmed from being unable to protect her when she died before his reincarnation, and the loss weighed heavily on him. Tarask backed away and said he only wanted to find Martha so he could protect her, but that seemed impossible now that she was gone. Isaiah, in a hooded jacket, tapped at his phone to search for anyone matching the description Tarask had given. Shirzwa, annoyed, demanded to know what he was doing. Isaiah explained that he was looking for matches to the dragon's description and had added a filter for members of the church. The search returned one result, an excommunicated nun named Asia Argento. Isaiah showed Tarask the image on his phone. The dragon recognized the woman as Martha and pleaded to be led to her. Isaiah reported that Miss Argento was currently in Kuoh and attending the academy there, serving as a reincarnated devil under the House of Gremory. Tarask insisted on being taken to her, vowing to protect her regardless of what she had become. Alpha confirmed that they would take him because they were going there as well. A female voice instructed Tarask to shrink for travel. The ex-evil dragon nodded and transformed into a small, turtle-sized version of himself. Koro hurried over, placed the tiny Tarask in its mouth, and Serio hauled them both into a van that sped toward the nearest airport. The next day at the Occult Research Club, Azazel sat at Rias's desk and announced that he would be the club's supervising teacher from that day forward, asking to be called Azazel. Issei, surprised by the fallen angel's presence, stared at the arm that had once been missing and questioned Azazel about it. Azazel explained that he had replaced the missing limb with a special prosthetic developed in his sacred gear research. To demonstrate, his left arm detached like a small rocket, circled the room, and reattached itself to his remaining limb. He added that Yuma was currently testing a prototype replacement and that he planned further adjustments later that day. Rias puffed her cheeks as Azazel continued, mentioning that he had come by order of Surzex and that he had no intention of being a mere figurehead. He stated his intention to train every student who possessed a sacred gear to improve their use of it. Azazel asked the Holy Devil Sword user how long they could sustain their balance breaker. The user replied that their limit was about an hour. Azazel insisted that was insufficient and set a new goal of sustaining it for at least 3 days. He turned his attention to Issei and noted that Issei had yet to unlock his full power, pointing out that Issei could only hold his temporary balance breaker for about 10 seconds. Azazel compared that to Valet, who could reportedly sustain his balance breaker for a month, and suggested they would have to start training Issei from the beginning. Issei sighed and admitted he felt doomed, drawing sympathetic looks from the other club members. Azazel's expression turned impish as he announced, by Surzek's Lucifer's directive, that all female members of the Occult Research Club were to relocate to Issei Hayadu's residence. Issei stared in shock at the unexpected order. Rias and Asia looked resigned. Aquino wore a small, knowing smile. Kaneko remained indifferent while nibbling chocolate, and Zenobia muttered that this arrangement improved her chances in some unspecified way. Issei protested that his house was not large enough to accommodate everyone, and Azazel assured him that Surzek would handle the logistics. Azazel then addressed Aquino and brought up her long-standing grudge against the fallen angel Baraquil. Aquino reaffirmed that she would never think of him as her father. Azazel acknowledged her feelings but suggested that joining the Gremory peerage had not been a mistake and wondered aloud how Baraquil would react to the current developments. With nothing more to add, Azazel dismissed them, and the club members left the room. Edward, Rose, and Yuma entered after the others had gone. Rose impatiently expressed her desire to move out of Edward's place and start settling into a new location. Azazel told them he had called them for an important matter. He had prepared improved prosthetic replacements for Yuma and asked her to try them behind a curtain. Yuma's eyes lit up. She accepted the new limbs and stepped behind the curtain to put them on. Azazel then addressed the incident from the previous night, saying that another section of the Cow's Brigade, the hero faction, had attempted to recruit Edward and Rose. Azazel expressed concern about the young girl who had been with them and questioned how trustworthy her account was. Edward and Rose responded that the girl was only 10 and that both Lord Michael and Lord Lucifer had sensed no ill intentions from her. Azazel acknowledged the oversight and released them to wait for Yuma before departing. Yuma emerged from behind the curtain carrying her old replacement limbs and handed them to Azazel. Yuma cheered farewell to Lord Azazel and thanked him for the new limbs as the 3 second years left the ORC, which made Edward sigh at the girl. It still seemed impossible that one of the most feared fallen angels could become that sweet young girl. When the 3 Academy students appeared at Edward's home through a magic circle, Edward paused at the door. The 2 girls accompanying him looked at him in confusion. Rose asked quietly what was wrong as she summoned tormentation of the soul on her arm. Yuma drew her katana and rested a hand on the hilt. Instead of preparing for a fight, Edward walked into the house and a sudden tackling sound followed. The 2 women rushed in and found Edward beneath a pile of people. They asked who the others were. Those who had been on top got off. The Pinkette helped Edward to his feet. Edward apologized to Rose and explained that he had not introduced these guests because the opportunity had never come up. He said he would call the others down for introductions and pressed a button on his phone. Within minutes, more occupants of the mansion arrived. Maihi descended the stairs first, finally in normal clothes instead of her kimono. She was followed by the 3 fallen angels who lived with Edward: Calawarner, Donasik, and Middlet. Calawarner carried a semi-awake Gilgamesh in her arms. The bishop asked cautiously who the newcomers were and advised everyone to be on their guard. Edward waved off the tension and began the introductions. He named Ikaros Angel, Bowles, Akame, Kurome, Toka Yatagami, Shirzwa Hauma, Seri Ubiquitous with Koro, and Isaiah Orihara. Each responded in kind with a polite bow, a small wave, or, in Toka's case, an enthusiastic leap. Rose dismissed her sacred gear and Yuma relaxed her grip on the katana, then asked for clarification about who they were. Edward answered plainly that they were the rest of his peerage. The revelation left everyone stunned. Gilgamesh, now fully awake, then asked what a peerage was. Outside, Issei stood with a twitching eye and stared at what had been his small home and was now a 5-star hotel-like mansion. He could not fathom what had happened overnight to transform his place. He muttered in disbelief at the sight. Kiba called to ask if Issei was ready for a trip. Kiba arrived with Kaneko and Gasper. Rias approached with Aquino, Asia, and Zenobia close behind and announced that they would all be going to the Gremory territory in the underworld for the summer. Issei brightened at the idea, remembering his earlier casual summer plans and letting out a small, resigned sigh. Rias asked if he already had other plans. Issei admitted he had only wanted to visit the beach and the pool. Rias explained that while the Devil Realm lacked an ocean, there was a very large lake, plenty of pools, and hot springs. Issei's eyes widened at the mention of hot springs. He briefly imagined relaxing with the others and smiled inwardly, then quickly tried to compose himself. Kaneko gave him a disapproving look and scolded him for entertaining improper thoughts. Issei apologized and backed away, then noticed with concern that Kaneko did not continue speaking and wondered if something was wrong with her. Azazel appeared nearby, commenting that Issei's expressions were surprising, and asked Edward for his opinion. He stood beside a modest pile of luggage. Rias demanded to know how he had entered. Azazel answered that he had come through the front door and that he had business in the Devil Realm. Kiba said he could not sense Edward nearby, prompting Azazel to pat the luggage. A pair of red eyes blinked open from a small gap, revealing Edward's presence within. Azazel explained that he had been invited to the Devil Realm by Miss Citri and that Lady Leviathan had requested his attendance as well. Asia looked worried and asked whether Edward was carrying Azazel's luggage. Azazel clarified that he had asked Edward to carry it. With that settled, everyone urged moving on to the train station. Edward said that he wanted to meet up with Yuma and Gil there so they could head to the Citri territory. Rias looked at his eyes with curiosity and asked why Sona had invited him to the underworld. Edward explained that the Citri parents wanted to thank him for protecting their daughter during the Kokabeel incident, and that although he felt he did not deserve thanks, he had agreed to go with his sisters. He added that he had no idea why Lady Leviathan had invited him and wanted to hurry to find out. Rias accepted that answer and began gathering her luggage, asking if Edward could carry hers and everyone else's. Edward scanned the pile of bags and suitcases, thinking it would be fine since he was already carrying his sister's luggage. Without any sign of struggle, the bottom of the pile lifted from the ground and moved toward a limousine that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Issei sent a message that he was heading to the hot springs with the president and others from the Occult Research Club. His two friends replied with brusque, teasing insults. He replied back with a wry comment about being ahead of one of them already. At the train station, Yuma waved to the group, and Gilgamesh stood beside him in a white sundress with her hair in a braid, clearly excited about their summer getaway. The others chuckled at her enthusiasm as the small blonde nearby ran up to the moving pile of luggage and jumped on it, urging her older companion to hurry. Not wanting to disappoint her, the man quickened his pace toward the station entrance. Rias stopped at a section of wall and pressed a hidden button, revealing a secret escalator. She led everyone down, and Edward returned the luggage to the pile. At the bottom of the escalator they found Tsubaki waiting. Sona gave a gesture for Edward and his sisters to follow. As the two groups parted, Sona asked Rias to pass along a greeting to Lord Lucifer if Rias saw him first. Edward and the three followed Tsubaki to a sleek silver train with blue trim and a Citri family crest on the doors. Sona welcomed Edward and his group aboard, and the train began to depart only after everyone was aboard, as the conductor had been instructed to wait. Inside the car they found Saji, Ruruko, Momo, Tsubasa, Tomo, Rhea, and Yumi, and Sona apologized for making them wait. Momo explained that the train would not have left without Edward, since the conductor had been told to wait for him. Gilgamesh, delighted by the company, went over to Tsubasa Yura and asked to braid her hair. The otherwise reserved girl allowed it, and soon several others gathered so Gilgamesh could braid their hair as well. Saji remarked that Edward's sister was dangerous, but she paid him no mind. A heated dare between two of the group amounted to loud, teasing threats, which Tsubaki immediately told them to calm down over, reminding them that arguing over a child's play was not worth hurting one another. Tsubaki then felt a tug on her skirt and looked down to see Gilgamesh giving her an imploring look. The stoic girl hugged the child, and the others laughed, leaving the queen blushing with embarrassment. An hour into the trip, Tsubaki, Yuma, and Gilgamesh had fallen asleep, and Saji was lying on a sofa with a book over his face. Edward felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Sona's peerage looking at him with serious expressions. They asked him to go and beat Sona in a game of chess, explaining that she always boasted about his skill while claiming the rest of them were far below him. They wanted him to go to her cabin and prove she was wrong. Reluctant but persuaded, Edward stood and made his way to Sona's cabin. Inside, Sona sat brooding over a letter from her family, especially one from her father. She crumpled the parchment and tossed it into the wastebasket just as Edward entered. He asked if it was a bad time to play chess, and Sona shook her head, saying she needed a distraction. Edward set up the board, oriented the white pieces toward her, and Sona offered a subtle nod of thanks before making the first move. However, throughout the hour-long match, even though she poured herself into it, her mind kept drifting back to the letter from her father arranging a chess match between her and the next heir to the Nibirius clan. The letter had included videos showcasing the opponent's skill, and those recordings had made her own play feel inadequate. She sighed inwardly, fearing that her freedom and dreams might hinge on an impending loss to that devil. The opponent announced that it was checkmate, snapping the Citri heiress out of her thoughts. She saw a black pawn directly in front of her king, flanked by two more pawns she remembered had been promoted to rooks. Edward rose, bowed, and thanked her for the match before excusing himself and returning to the other cabin. He left, and a small smile touched her lips as she scanned the cameras mounted around the train car. She wondered if she could extract the video feed and immediately set to work retrieving the footage that had captured the game. Back in the peerage car, Tomo, Tsubasa, Momo, Rhea, Ruruko, and Yumi watched Edward return. After about an hour he walked in and gave the group a thumbs up. The 5 girls erupted in loud cheers, rousing Tsubaki, Yuma, Gilgamesh, and Saji from their naps. Saji yawned and, rubbing his eyes, asked sleepily what all the shouting was about and whether they had arrived yet. When he looked out the window and realized they had reached Citri territory, he offered a weary smile, stretched until his back popped, and asked what he had missed while he slept. A bump from the storage compartment drew everyone's attention. A suitcase popped out, landed, and opened to reveal the small form of Koro. The Citri peerage blinked in surprise as Gilgamesh leapt forward and hugged the little dog protectively. Edward looked down and asked why Koro had been in Gilgamesh's suitcase. Gilgamesh stammered that Miss Seriou had said Koro could come to protect her. Edward crouched, patted her head, and told her it was fine while reminding her to mention such things in the future. The young blonde brightened, gave him her brightest smile, and nodded. When the train stopped, the conductor scanned Yumi, Edward, Yuma, and Gilgamesh and explained that without the check they would not have been allowed to disembark. He then bowed and wished Lady Sona a wonderful day. The group of 11 stepped off the train and came face to face with a giant castle. 3 of them gaped at its scale while Edward looked to Sona and asked how large her family's territory was. A maid in a traditional English uniform, Sarah Bifrons, replied that the Citri domain was slightly smaller than the Gremory clan but nearly the size of Japan's Honshu Island, then welcomed Lady Sona back and hoped her trip had been relaxing. Sona returned Sarah's greeting and said the train ride had been peaceful, adding that nothing could have ruined it. Sarah's expression tightened at that final remark, a quiet reminder of what awaited them inside. Sarah introduced herself as head maid of the Citri household and as Lady Leviathan's bishop, curtsied, and led the group toward the front doors. Inside, a butler named Vincent Ranov, the head butler and pawn to Lady Leviathan, stepped forward to welcome his mistress and instructed them to follow him to the Lord and Lady. They followed Sarah and Vincent to an ornate set of doors. Inside, 5 people sat at a large table. 2 of the slightly older devils, a man with blue eyes and a woman with violet eyes, wore formal black attire and an aquamarine dress. Edward recognized them as Lord and Lady Citri. The other 3 were 2 men with dark brown hair and eyes and a woman with orange hair and calm green eyes. The younger man wore his suit jacket open, revealing a sculpted torso that briefly reminded Edward of Lord Reiser, though this man did not carry the same arrogance. The older man had a neatly trimmed beard and wore a black dress shirt under a lab coat. The woman in a bright green dress radiated an elegant presence. Sona's mother greeted her warmly, expressing how pleased she was to see her and asking how the human world had treated her. Sona returned the sentiment and said that life among humans had been treating her well, then asked why Lord and Lady Nibirius had come with their son. Koro tensed in Gilgamesh's arms and began to tremble at the mention. Her father attempted to steer the conversation toward beginning the match, reminding Sona of the purpose of their guest's visit and urging her to sit and start the game. Sona cut him off with a firm refusal. Lord Nibirius reacted with outrage, demanding how she could refuse after he had come to beat her at chess and claim the right to marry her. The outburst shocked the peerage, Edward, and Yuma. Only Tsubaki watched the scene with a steady, disapproving gaze. Her father pressed the point, insisting she had received his letter about Alphonse's challenge and must not back out. Her father reminded Sona that that was the agreement she had signed for the terms of being wed, looking at his daughter with a raised eyebrow while her mother watched her in silence. He asked if there was anything she wished to tell them. Sona only nodded and motioned for Edward to step forward. Her father thanked Edward for protecting his daughter and her peerage during the Kokabile incident, then asked why Sona had asked him to step forward. A strange tension settled over Edward, Tomo, Tsubasa, Momo, Rhea, Ruruko, and Yumi as they stared at Sona. She reached into her blazer pocket, produced a small chip, and placed it on the table, explaining that Edward had won a game of chess. The room fell deathly quiet. Alphonse suddenly leapt over the table in a rage and rushed at Edward with a dagger. Before he reached him, Yuma's katana appeared at Alphonse's throat in a blur, delivering a firm warning touch of heat that pinned him in place. Alphonse glared at the sight of Yuma's blade. Sona's mother asked when the chess match had taken place, and Lord Nibirius scowled at both his son's actions and at losing the Citri heiress. Sona explained that she had lost to Edward on their way to the meeting that day. He had asked to play a game of chess without knowing about the contract, and she believed he was a better choice than Alphonse Nibirius. She added that they could ask Serafal for an outside opinion. Lord Nibirius called his son back. Yuma sheathed her katana and stepped away, though the Lord groaned as he turned to Lord Citri and asked how they should settle the matter, noting that his son would not back down. Edward interrupted by proposing a rating game, his peerage against Alphonse's. Alphonse laughed at the idea that Edward could have a peerage. Edward narrowed his eyes, raised his hand, and produced a glowing magic circle on the ground from which 9 people materialized. He presented them as his peerage to Lord Alphanus. The Nibirius heir's face at the sight of the 9 standing before them. At that moment, Sarah and Vincent announced that Lady Serafal had been notified and wanted the contest to occur after the Young Devils gathering, so the fight could be showcased to young devils, elders, and the Celtic pantheon considering alliance against the Cow's Brigade. The Citri and Nibirius heads nodded and were told to prepare for a raiding game the next day. Lord Nibirius's expression sharpened into a feral smirk. The Nibirius family left the room, leaving Sona, her peerage, her parents, Sarah, Vincent, Edward, his sisters, and his peerage behind. Edward bowed deeply at a perfect 90-degree angle and apologized for the trouble, explaining he had not known about the terms set up with Sona and asking for their forgiveness. His manner and words only confirmed the image of him that Serafal had described. Lord Citri assured Edward that it was all right and admitted he had not liked Alphonse either. From now on Edward could call him father. Lady Citri invited Edward to call her mother as well. Sona blushed furiously at her parents' words while a faint steam of embarrassment seemed to rise off Edward. Isaiah laughed loudly, declaring that their boss was genuinely flustered and that it was hilarious. Gilgamesh suddenly jabbed 2 fingers near Isaiah's face in reprimand, causing him to cry out. Gilgamesh glared, warning the others not to laugh at their older brother. Time passed. The next day, at the Young Devils gathering, Rheas walked with her peerage toward the meeting area and instructed them to be on their best behavior, reminding them they were representing both her and the Gremory clan. The peerage affirmed they would. Outside the gathering room, Serog Baal, the heir to the Baal clan and Rheas's cousin on her mother's side, stood waiting. Rheas introduced him to her peerage and noted he had been outside the room the whole time. He explained that he had stepped out because Glaciolabelas and Agars had started a scuffle inside, and he had planned to wait it out. The brawny devil opened the door to find 2 devils, 1 male and 1 female, in the midst of an argument with furniture damaged around them. Serorg ordered them to stop, which caused the Agar's heiress to halt, but the Glaciolabelas heir continued to argue and insult. Zephyrdore's words were cut short when Edward, a very familiar figure to the Gremory group, delivered a decisive punch that sent him into the wall. Edward explained that no one liked pompous idiots who mistreated women and that such people could be stopped with a single solid blow. The group reacted with surprise at Edward's sudden appearance and action. Rhea strode forward and demanded to know what he was doing there. The Celt only waved in response as Serorg and the Agar's heiress approached. Sikvera, the light blonde devil, adjusted her glasses and asked Rhys if she knew the newcomer. Rhys explained that she did know him and introduced him as Edward Chulainn, the current Siu Chulainn and a human in possession of holy, demon, and legendary weapons. Edward bowed slightly to the two heirs and offered that they could call him Edward. Serorg dismissed the use of any formal title, saying that Edward had earned his respect by saving him the trouble of dealing with Zephyrdor and by being strong for a human. He asked Edward to call him Serorg. Sikvera asked to be called Sikvera and remarked that anyone who had Rhys's respect had hers as well. Rhys asked Edward why he had come, drawing the attention of the Baal and Agar's heirs and another heir who had just arrived. Edward replied that they would have to wait until after the meeting to find out. Sona and her peerage entered, and another devil opened the doors to lead the heirs into the meeting room. Edward sank into a chair with a tired sigh as the Gremory peerage gathered around him. Issei enthusiastically praised the way Edward had punched a man and sent him flying, but Edward only shook his head and asked to be left alone to take a short nap for later. The peerage exchanged surprised looks as Edward leaned back and dozed lightly. Kiba remarked that whatever had just happened must be important if Edward needed to nap immediately. The group made their way back toward the Citri peerage and saw Saji about to barge into the meeting room, furious and ready to confront the council. Tsubaki stepped in front of the door and told Saji to hold his place, reminding him that this was not the time for such behavior because the council president was there to state her goals. Saji looked away, defeated, and clenched his fist. A sound of munching drew their attention. A dark plum-haired girl had appeared, eating a bag of chips. She told them it would be a disaster to interrupt because it would only embarrass the president and make her look foolish before the council elders. She finished the bag, which someone crumpled and tossed toward Issei, who had allowed his attention to wander and now looked awkward and flustered. Sherzwa leaned behind her and admonished Issei to keep his gaze appropriate. The newcomers put the Gremorys on guard, and the group realized they were surrounded. Aquino shouted, and a pink-haired girl stepped forward to speak. The pink-haired girl introduced herself as Ikaros Angel and identified herself as a mutation queen. A tall, muscular man in baggy white pants and a mask then approached and introduced himself as Bowles, a mutation bishop, and offered cookies. Asia, Kaneko, and Gasper accepted the bags of chocolate chip cookies and began eating. Two Ravenettes walked forward. The older sister, Akame, introduced herself and her little sister Kurome as mutation knights. Kurome took an extra bag of cookies and began eating. Toka Yatagami announced herself as a mutation rook in an excited burst, only to be cut off by the tall blonde who tossed the crumpled bag earlier. The blonde introduced himself as Sherzwa Haiwadma, also a rook. And the second strongest member on their peerage behind Alpha, nodding toward the pink-haired girl who sat quietly, petting a watermelon. The brunette with the short ponytail presented herself as Sari Ubiquitous and introduced her partner, the small dog Koro, explaining she served as a pawn of 3. Koro gave everyone a salute. A sly young man introduced himself as Izaya or Ihara and described himself as a singular pawn, warning them not to underestimate him despite his position. The doors behind them opened to reveal Maihi and Yuma, with a small blonde riding on Yuma's back. Yuma scolded the group for waiting in the lobby when they had been told to wait for a signal. The little blonde mirrored her puffed cheeks. Suddenly Koro convulsed and regurgitated an oddly shaped shell. The newcomers stared, and Sherzwa remarked that they had apparently forgotten to take the creature out of the dog. Legs unfolded from the sides of the shell, a stubby tail arose from the back, and a draconic, leonine head emerged at the front. The little creature demanded to know where someone named Martha was and whether they had arrived at her location. Dakaros stepped forward and told the creature that Martha was over there and urged it to be reunited with the one it wished to protect. The devils present fell silent at the name. Tarask, the tiny beast, turned toward Asia with tears welling in its eyes. The tiny evil dragon cried out for Martha and leaped into Asia's arms. He inhaled sharply and stammered that her scent matched Martha's, begging to be made her familiar so he could protect her as he had failed to protect the saint before. The ex-nun did not know how to respond. He was comparing her to the saint who had pacified him. As she hesitated, tears formed in his eyes and he began to weep, pleading that without the contract he would lose his will to live. Asia's eyes widened, then she slowly nodded. The dragon's tears turned from sorrow to joy. The blonde bishop set him gently on the ground. As he looked up, 2 overlapping green squares covered in archaic writing appeared beneath Tarrasque. Asia performed a brief ritual in her name, ordering him to form a contract as her familiar. With the ritual complete, the stone-armored dragon exhaled and crawled onto Asia's back, vowing that he would allow no harm to come to her and that he would give his life for her safety. Everyone exchanged uneasy looks at the scene until a creaking sound drew their attention. They turned and saw Edward standing and stretching. He reported that he had received a notification from Lady Leviathan and that they were to enter immediately, and that Alphonse Nibirius should already be inside. The Gremory group tilted their heads in puzzlement until new arrivals, with Maihi, Yuma, and Gilgamesh on Yuma's back, fell in behind the Celt. The doors opened and one of the elders asked what this raiding game meant. Surzex explained that Lady Leviathan had given only vague details and asked for clarification. Serafal informed the gathered company that a raiding game was to be held between Alphonse Nibirius and Edward Chulainn. The elders questioned why these two were paired, suggesting the match seemed one-sided, and Serafal laughed, noting that Alphonse should surrender to avoid getting hurt. Her suggestion that a human might defeat the Nibirius heir surprised everyone. Serafal then announced that the two would be competing for her little sister's hand in marriage and said she trusted Edward more than Alphonse to care for her sister. The room fell into a tense and incredulous silence. Rias, Sikvera, and Serorg, who had known the Citri heiress for most of their lives, were stunned, and the elders were shocked that a human would be competing for a devil's hand. Edward felt their stares but kept a neutral expression and indicated that he understood. He and Alphonse vanished into a magic circle and entered the raiding game field. Caladbolg was the legendary Irish sword wielded by the descendants of Fergus, son of Roich. Though not a holy blade, its destructive power rivaled that of the holy sword Durandal. It lay bound in chains inside a vault in Dun Scaith, the domain of Scathach, waiting for the next descendant to appear. The blade was a curved, spiked greatsword of pale cerulean with a silver edge. Gold fittings along the flats anchored the chains and helped absorb the sword's power. There was no guard, only a spike above the hilt and a gold pommel. When the chains released their hold, a rainbow aura shimmered around the blade, and a single sweep of Caladbolg could lay waste to armies and reshape hilltops. Arondite was the holy sword of Sir Lancelot of the Lake from Arthurian legend. It was one of the few holy swords stored in the vaults of heaven and was counted a sister to Excalibur and Gallatin, bearing a minor dragon-slayer quality. During Sir Lancelot's betrayal it had been tainted and turned toward darker use, but after Lancelot's death it was brought to heaven and transformed into a smaller state that reflected the remaining measure of its holy energy. It would only be wielded by one with a pure heart. The blade was steel gray and short, its flats patterned in black and dark gray. The hilt was black with a steel gray trim, the guard curved slightly upward, and a red jewel bearing a black cross was set into it. Within that jewel lay the dormant soul of Bahamut, the heavenly ruler dragon, who had sought union with the sword after causing great destruction with his aura. With the dragon's presence the blade could summon a suit of armor and assume an elongated form. The board of champions was arranged as follows. Edward Chulainn served as king. Queen Ikaros, known as Alpha and altered by mutation, stood as queen. The bishops were Bowles, a mutated figure, and Maihi. The knights were Akame and Kurom, both altered by mutation. The rooks were Toka Yatagami, altered by mutation, and Shirzwa Hiwajima. The pawns included 3 Seryu. Ubiquitous, Isaiah Orihara, Yuma Amano altered by mutation, and 3 Gilgamesh figures altered by mutation. Characters from Akame Jekil included Akame, Kurom, Bowles, and Seryu Ubiquitous. Toka Yatagami came from Date A Live. Ikaros originated from Heaven's lost property. Shares wa Hiwajima and Isaiah or Ihara came from Durarara.